Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. The first thing David noticed when he woke up was how quiet the house felt. No sound of coffee brewing. No footsteps moving around the bedroom. Just silence. He turned over in bed and saw his wife, Lisa, sitting upright, staring at him. Her eyes were open wide, unblinking. David rubbed his face and groaned. "Morning already?" Lisa did not respond. She just sat there, watching him. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. The way she sat, so still, so rigid, made his stomach twist. Something was off. David sat up and forced a smile. "Everything okay?" Lisa finally blinked, tilting her head slightly. Then, in a calm voice, she said, "Do you know what today is?" David's mind went blank. His eyes darted to the calendar on the nightstand. His heart sank. Their anniversary. His throat went dry. He had completely forgotten. No dinner reservations. No gift. Nothing. David forced a chuckle and scratched the back of his head. "Of course, I know what today is." Lisa smiled, but it was a strange, stretched smile, like she was trying too hard. She said, "Good. Then today will be perfect." Something in the way she said it sent a chill down his spine. David got out of bed and headed to the bathroom. As he brushed his teeth, he tried to think of a way to fix this. Maybe he could run out and buy flowers. Maybe he could pretend he had planned something all along. When he stepped back into the bedroom, Lisa was no longer sitting on the bed. She was gone. David called, "Lisa?" No response. He walked down the hall, peeking into the kitchen. Lisa stood at the counter, making breakfast. The smell of bacon and eggs filled the air. She hummed softly, swaying from side to side. David hesitated before stepping closer. "You okay?" Lisa placed a plate in front of him and said, "Eat up. We have a big day ahead of us." David frowned. "What do you mean?" Lisa smiled again, the same forced grin from earlier. "You'll see." David sat down and took a bite. The eggs were cold. The bacon was undercooked. Lisa sat across from him, watching. He swallowed, feeling uneasy. She asked, "Do you love me?" David blinked. "Of course I do." Her smile widened. "Good. Then today will be perfect." She had already said that. David opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Lisa stood up abruptly and started clearing the table. Her movements were too fast, too stiff. Something was wrong. The day passed in a strange blur. Lisa planned everything. They went for a walk in the park, had lunch at a diner, and even watched a movie at home. But the entire time, Lisa kept watching him. Every time he looked at her, she was already staring. That night, as they lay in bed, Lisa whispered, "I love you, David." David swallowed. "I love you too." Lisa giggled softly. "Good. Then today will be perfect." David's body tensed. She had said it again. As he drifted off to sleep, unease settled deep in his chest. Something felt off about today. But by morning, he would learn that today wasn't over. It was just beginning. David woke to the sound of humming. His eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal. The morning light seeped through the curtains, and the scent of breakfast filled the air. Then he turned his head. Lisa sat upright in bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was staring at him. David's stomach twisted. Lisa said, "Do you know what today is?" David's breath caught in his throat. He had heard those exact words before. He sat up slowly, his heart pounding. "Lisa?" Lisa tilted her head, waiting for his answer. David's mouth went dry. His mind raced. This wasn't right. Yesterday had already happened. Hadn't it? He forced a chuckle. "Of course, I know what today is." Lisa smiled, too wide, too forced. She said, "Good. Then today will be perfect." David felt his skin prickle. This wasn't happening. He stumbled out of bed and rushed to the bathroom. He turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on his face. Staring at his reflection in the mirror, he whispered, "Just a weird dream. Just stress." But when he stepped back into the bedroom, Lisa was gone. Just like yesterday, David's hands trembled as he walked down the hall. The scent of bacon and eggs grew stronger. He entered the kitchen. Lisa stood at the counter, humming softly. The same tune, the same swaying motion. David swallowed hard. Lisa placed a plate in front of him. "Eat up. We have a big day ahead of us." David's mouth went dry. "Lisa, what's going on?" Lisa only smiled. He looked down at his plate. The eggs were cold. The bacon was undercooked. Exactly like yesterday. David felt lightheaded. He pushed the plate away and stood. "Lisa, this isn't funny." Lisa's smile faltered for a second, but then it returned, stretched, unnatural. She asked, "Do you love me?" David's heart pounded. He whispered, "Lisa, please." Lisa's fingers curled slightly, her nails digging into the wooden table. Her voice was still calm, but there was something beneath it, something dark. She asked again, "Do you love me?" David nodded quickly, "Yes. Yes, I love you." Lisa beamed, "Good. Then today will be perfect." David's breath came in short, uneven gasps. He backed away from the table. This was wrong. He grabbed his phone. The date read, June 7th. Their anniversary. David felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had seen this date yesterday. He had already lived this day. Hadn't he? Lisa continued clearing the table, moving too fast, too stiff. David whispered to himself, "Wake up. This has to be a dream." Lisa turned her head sharply, her eyes locking onto him. She said, "Are you feeling okay, love?" David forced a nod. "Yeah. Just tired." Lisa smiled again, the same unnatural grin. She whispered, "Don't worry. You'll get used to it." David's stomach dropped. Used to it. The rest of the day played out exactly as before. The walk in the park, the lunch at the diner, the movie at home. Every glance, every word, every moment, identical to yesterday. That night, as they lay in bed, Lisa whispered, "I love you, David." David's throat tightened. "I love you too." Lisa giggled softly. "Good. Then today will be perfect." David squeezed his eyes shut. His body trembled. Tomorrow would be different. But deep down, he wasn't sure if there would be a tomorrow at all. David woke to humming. His eyes snapped open. Lisa sat upright in bed, hands folded neatly in her lap. Staring at him, a shiver ran down his spine. Lisa said, "Do you know what today is?" David's stomach lurched. No, this couldn't be happening again. His breath quickened as he whispered, "Lisa, please." Lisa tilted her head, waiting. David squeezed his hands into fists. He needed to do something, anything, to break this. He forced a smile. June 7th. Our anniversary. Lisa's lips curled into that too-wide grin. Good. Then today will be perfect. David felt sick. He threw off the blanket and stumbled out of bed. He needed proof. Something to confirm he wasn't losing his mind. He grabbed his phone. June 7th. The same. The exact same. His pulse pounded in his ears as he rushed to the closet and yanked open the doors. His work clothes hung in the exact same spot. His shoes were placed neatly on the floor, just like yesterday. David turned, breathing heavily. Lisa was gone, just like before. He ran down the hall, nearly tripping over himself. The scent of breakfast filled the air. No. David skidded into the kitchen. Lisa stood at the counter, humming softly. Swaying. She turned and placed a plate in front of him. "Eat up. We have a big day ahead of us." David staggered back, knocking over a chair. "Lisa, stop. Stop this." Lisa blinked. "What's wrong, love?" David's chest rose and fell rapidly. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out of the house. His fingers trembled as he grabbed his phone again. and dialed a number. Come on, come on. A voice answered. Hello. David gasped. Mark. It's me. I need your help. Mark, his best friend, hesitated. David? You okay, man? David opened his mouth to speak, but then he felt it. Lisa was staring at him. Her smile was gone. Her face was empty, expressionless. David gripped the phone tighter. Mark, listen to me. I don't know what's happening, but I think. The call cut off. The screen went dark. No signal. David's breathing turned ragged. Lisa's voice was soft. Who are you talking to? David's hands shook as he lowered the phone. Lisa, what's happening to me? Lisa tilted her head. Happening to you? She stepped closer. David stumbled back. She whispered, This is our day, David. It's special. It has to be perfect. David's vision blurred with panic. No, Lisa. This isn't right. It's the same day. Over and over. Lisa frowned slightly, as if confused. Then she smiled again. She said, Do you love me? David's breath caught in his throat. The walls felt like they were closing in. Lisa asked again, Do you love me, David? David swallowed hard. Why, yes. Lisa's grin stretched wider than before. Good, she whispered. Then today will be perfect. David's stomach churned. The words didn't feel like a promise. They felt like a threat. David couldn't breathe. His skin crawled under Lisa's unblinking gaze. He needed to get out. He forced a chuckle, stepping toward the door. I just need some fresh air, okay? Lisa's eyes darkened. She whispered, You're leaving? David hesitated. Lisa smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. But we have so much to do today. David forced himself to nod. I'll be right back. I promise. Lisa's expression remained unreadable. Then she said, Okay, love, but hurry back. David turned, gripping the doorknob with sweaty hands. He twisted it. Locked. His breath hitched. He yanked harder. Still locked. His heart pounded. He checked the deadbolt, twisted it. It didn't budge. What? Lisa's voice came from right behind him. You promised, remember? David spun to face her. She stood unnaturally close. Her head tilted slightly, lips still curled into that eerie smile. David took a shaky step back. Lisa. Unlocked the door. Lisa just stared. David's pulse hammered in his ears. Lisa, open the damn door. Her smile widened. She whispered, I can't let you ruin our day. David's stomach twisted. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something, anything. His eyes darted to the windows. He ran. The glass was cold beneath his fingertips as he tried to slide it open. Locked. David's breath came in shallow gasps. His whole body shook. Lisa giggled softly. You're being silly, love. David turned, pressing his back against the wall. Lisa, please. Just tell me what's happening. Lisa's smile faltered. She whispered, You forgot me, David. David blinked. What? Lisa's voice wavered. You forgot our day. Again. 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 Her head twitched violently to the side. David swallowed hard. Lisa, I didn't mean to. I swear. Lisa's face twisted into something unreadable. Then she whispered, We can't let that happen. David's blood ran cold. He took slow, measured steps toward the hallway. If he could just get to the bedroom, maybe. Lisa's head snapped toward him. She said, Where are you going? David's mouth went dry. Lisa, please. Lisa's smile returned, but her eyes were empty. She whispered, Come have breakfast, love. Everything will be perfect soon. David's whole body trembled. His gut told him one thing. If he didn't find a way out today, he might never leave. David's hands were clammy. His skin felt too tight, his breath too shallow. He had to think. Lisa just stood there, smiling, waiting. David forced a nod. Okay. I'll eat. Lisa's head tilted slightly, watching him. Then, as if satisfied, she turned and walked back toward the kitchen. David followed slowly, his mind racing. He needed a way out. Lisa placed a plate in front of him, scrambled eggs, toast, and a slice of bacon. Exactly the same as before. She sat across from him, hands folded neatly. Lisa said, "Eat, love." David picked up his fork. His heart pounded. The food looked normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Lisa's fingers tapped lightly against the table. David forced a bite into his mouth. It tasted fine, but his stomach twisted painfully. Lisa beamed. "See? Perfect." David chewed slowly, trying to keep his breathing steady. Then, his gaze flicked to the knife beside his plate. A way out. His fingers twitched. If he could grab it. Lisa's voice was soft. "Are you thinking of hurting me?" David froze. The room felt too quiet. Lisa's smile never faded. She whispered, "You wouldn't do that, would you, love?" David forced a swallow. Lisa leaned forward slightly. "You love me, don't you?" David's grip on the fork tightened. His mind screamed at him to lie. He nodded. "Of course, Lisa." Lisa's eyes darkened slightly, but her smile remained. "Good." David slowly set his fork down. His palms were sweaty. Lisa said, "You should finish your meal. We have a wonderful day planned." David's stomach churned. Then an idea struck him. "Lisa," he said carefully, "could you get me some coffee?" Lisa blinked. She whispered, "Coffee?" David nodded quickly. "Yeah. I think it'll help me feel better." Lisa studied him. Then she stood. "Of course, love." She turned to the counter. David moved. His fingers wrapped around the knife. He swallowed hard, heart hammering against his ribs. He had one chance. Lisa's voice was soft. "What are you doing, David?" David's breath hitched. She hadn't turned around, but she knew. Slowly, Lisa turned to face him. Her expression was blank. Then, her mouth twitched into a grin. She whispered, "That's not very nice, love." David bolted. Lisa's footsteps were right behind him. His pulse pounded as he reached the hallway, sprinting toward the bedroom. The door slammed shut behind him. He twisted the lock with shaking fingers. Silence. David backed away, gasping for air. Then, tap, tap, tap. Lisa's voice was a sing-song whisper. "David, open the door." David shook his head violently. "No, just stop. Please." Lisa giggled. "Tap, tap, tap." She whispered, "You'll love me forever. Won't you?" David's chest tightened. Lisa whispered, "That's why we have to do this again." David's stomach twisted painfully. His voice was hoarse. "What are you talking about?" Silence. Then, Lisa's voice was so soft he almost didn't hear it. "You always forget." David's blood ran cold. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Lisa whispered, "But don't worry. Tomorrow you'll remember." David's breath hitched. Tomorrow. Tomorrow wasn't coming, because today would never end. David pressed his back against the wall, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The room felt smaller, the air thinner. Lisa's voice was soft, almost a whisper. "You always forget, David." He clenched his fists, his breath ragged. David said, "Lisa, please just tell me what's happening." Silence. Then, a slow, deliberate knock on the door. Tap, tap, tap. Lisa whispered, "You should sleep, love. It'll be better tomorrow." David shook his head. No, I don't want tomorrow. I want a day to end." Lisa giggled softly. "Oh, David, today never ends. Not until you remember." David's stomach turned. He had to get out. He scanned the room, searching for anything that could help. His eyes landed on the window. The glass reflected his pale, terrified face. Escape. David lunged toward it, gripping the edges. He pushed up. Locked. His breath hitched. He yanked harder. It wouldn't budge. From outside the door, Lisa's voice turned melodic, a sing-song whisper. "You forgot again. Again. Again." David slammed his fist against the glass. "Lisa, stop." Silence. Then, The doorknob rattled. David's chest tightened. Lisa whispered, "Don't make this harder, love." David grabbed the bedside lamp, his hands shaking. Lisa's voice darkened. "David?" He swung. Glass shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Cold night air rushed in. David didn't hesitate. He gripped the window frame, ignoring the sharp edges biting into his palms. He pulled himself up, hoisting his body over the ledge. Then, a hand clamped around his ankle. David gasped, kicking wildly. Lisa's voice was calm, steady. "You don't want to leave me." David thrashed, his heels slamming into something solid. Lisa let out a low, breathy laugh. Then she yanked. David's body lurched backward. He crashed onto the floor, glass crunching beneath him. Pain shot through his shoulder. Lisa loomed over him. Her hair fell over her face, her wide smile stretching unnaturally. Lisa whispered, "You always try to run." David scrambled backward, his hands slipping on the floor. Lisa knelt down, her fingers brushing his cheek. Her voice was almost tender. "But it's okay. We'll try again tomorrow." David shook his head violently. "No. No, please." Lisa pressed a finger to his lips. She whispered, "Just sleep now." Darkness swallowed him whole. David's eyes snapped open. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across the bedroom. The scent of coffee and bacon filled the air. His heart slammed against his ribs. "No." Slowly, he turned his head. Lisa stood in the doorway, smiling. Lisa said, "Good morning, love. Happy anniversary." David's breath came in ragged gasps. His body was drenched in sweat. His fingers dug into the sheets. It had happened again. Lisa walked toward him, setting a tray of food on the nightstand. The same plate of scrambled eggs. The same toast. The same single strip of bacon. David whispered, "No." Lisa's head tilted slightly. David shot up from the bed, stumbling back until his shoulders hit the wall. His pulse thundered in his ears. David's voice was hoarse. You did something to me." Lisa only smiled. "Eat your breakfast, love. We have a wonderful day ahead of us." David's stomach twisted. He had to get out. Now. His eyes flicked toward the door. He could make a run for it. Lisa's voice was soft, knowing. "Are you going somewhere, David?" He swallowed hard. His skin prickled with fear. Lisa sat on the bed, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "You always do this." David's breath hitched. What are you talking about?" Lisa's smile never faltered. "You always forget." David's fists clenched. "Forget what?" Lisa reached forward, taking his hand gently in hers. Her fingers were ice cold. Lisa whispered, "That you love me." David yanked his hand away, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Lisa's expression darkened. Lisa said, "That's why we have to do it again." David's mind screamed. He stumbled toward the door, his fingers wrapping around the handle. He pulled. Locked. His stomach dropped. Lisa's voice was eerily calm. "You never listen, love." David spun around. Lisa stood in front of him now, her smile widening, her eyes unblinking. Lisa whispered, "But you will." David banged on the door. "Help! Somebody help me." Lisa giggled softly. "There's no one, David. There never was." David's fingers trembled as he pressed his back against the door. Lisa took a slow step forward. Lisa whispered, "Now let's start again." David's vision blurred. His body felt heavy. His knees buckled. The world faded into darkness. David's eyes shot open. The ceiling fan spun lazily above him. The room was bathed in soft morning light. A sickening sense of déjà vu crept over him. Slowly, he turned his head. Lisa stood in the doorway, smiling. Lisa said, "Good morning, love. Happy anniversary." David's breath caught in his throat. His fingers gripped the bedsheet. Not again. His body trembled as he sat up. David whispered, "Lisa, please stop this." Lisa's smile remained, but her eyes flickered with something cold. Lisa said, Stop what, love? David's fists clenched. I know what's happening. I know I'm trapped. Lisa chuckled softly. Trapped? Oh, David. You're home. David swallowed hard. He had to break the cycle. He needed to remember. David said, he hesitated, searching his mind. I forgot something. I forgot something important. Lisa's smile wavered for the first time. David's heart pounded. He was onto something. Lisa whispered, You always forget. David squeezed his eyes shut, forcing his mind to dig deeper. A memory surfaced. A blurred image, Lisa crying. The sound of breaking glass. His own voice, raised in anger. David gasped. David whispered, Lisa, what did I do? Lisa took a step closer. Her voice was almost gentle. You left me. David's breath hitched. David said, No, I didn't. Lisa's expression darkened. You forgot me, David. A sharp pain stabbed through his skull. He clutched his head. Images flashed. Lisa in a white dress, standing alone in the rain. The sound of screeching tires. A crash. A scream. David's stomach dropped. David whispered, You died. Lisa's face twitched. Her hands curled into fists. Lisa said, You left me alone. On our anniversary. You never came back. David's chest tightened. His body felt cold, like ice had settled in his bones. David said, I didn't mean to. Lisa's eyes gleamed with something unreadable. Lisa whispered, It doesn't matter now. You're here. David's pulse quickened. No, I don't belong here. Lisa's smile stretched too wide. But you do, love. You came back to me. David's hands trembled. He had to get out. Now. Lisa took another step forward, her voice a breathy whisper. You're never leaving again. David's heart pounded as the world around him began to twist. He was running out of time. David's breath came in short, panicked gasps. The walls of the bedroom seemed to pulse, stretching and contracting like something alive. David said, Lisa, this isn't real. Lisa's head tilted slightly, her smile never wavering. Lisa whispered, Isn't it? David pressed his hands to his temples. His memories were slipping, twisting. The past and present blurred together. But he knew one thing, this wasn't right. David said, You died. I was supposed to meet you, but I never showed up. Lisa's expression darkened. The air in the room grew heavy, pressing against his chest. Lisa said, You left me waiting, David. Standing in the rain, alone. David squeezed his eyes shut. He could see it now. The phone call he ignored. The dinner reservation he never made. The accident. David whispered, I'm sorry. Lisa's fingers twitched. For the first time, her smile faltered. David continued, I should have been there. I should have. Lisa's voice came in a sharp hiss. It doesn't matter anymore. David's eyes snapped open. Lisa was standing inches from him now. Her skin was pale, her once warm eyes hollow. Lisa whispered, Because now you'll stay. Forever. David's stomach twisted. The walls trembled. The door behind him slammed shut on its own. David took a step back. No, I can't stay. I don't belong here. Lisa's smile returned, stretching wider than humanly possible. Lisa whispered, You don't have a choice. David's pulse thundered. He had to break free. Now. David's mind raced. The walls around him pulsed like a living thing, the air thick with something unnatural. Lisa took a slow step forward, her bare feet soundless against the floor. Her voice was soft, almost tender. Lisa whispered, You don't have to fight it, love. This is where you belong. David shook his head, his breath ragged. David said, No, this isn't real. You're gone. I let you down, but I can't fix that by staying here. Lisa's smile twitched. The lights in the room flickered violently. The walls groaned. Lisa whispered, You already stayed. Every night you come back. Every night you forget. But I remember. I always remember. David clutched his head. The memories crashed into him. The drinking, the guilt, the nights spent staring at his phone, unable to call her. The years spent trying to forget. David gasped, This isn't my home. It's my prison." Lisa's voice dropped to a whisper, her tone filled with something dark and final. Lisa said, "And you built it yourself." The world twisted. The ceiling cracked. The air turned freezing. David's vision blurred, but deep inside, something snapped into place. He had to let go. David took a deep, shaky breath. David whispered, "Lisa, I love you, but I have to wake up." Lisa's smile vanished. Her face twisted in rage. Lisa shrieked, "No!" The room exploded into darkness. David screamed. David's scream echoed into the void. The walls collapsed into shadows, the floor beneath him dissolving into nothingness. He was falling, tumbling through darkness, Lisa's voice ringing in his ears. Lisa shrieked, "You can't leave me. You belong here." David squeezed his eyes shut. David whispered, "I'm sorry." A blinding white light burst through the darkness. A deafening silence followed. Then, David's eyes snapped open. He was lying in bed. His heart pounded against his ribs. The ceiling fan spun lazily above him. Morning light filtered through the curtains. Was it over? Slowly, he turned his head. Lisa wasn't there. The doorway was empty. The air was still. David sat up, his hands shaking. The weight in his chest felt lighter, but something inside him remained hollow. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, fingers trembling. The date flashed on the screen. His breath caught in his throat. It was his anniversary. Tears burned his eyes. David whispered, "I remember now." A deep ache filled his chest, but the air around him felt different. The cycle was broken. Lisa was gone, but so was the dream. David exhaled shakily and stood, feeling the weight of years settle over him. It was time to move forward, and this time he wouldn't forget. The house remained silent, but somewhere, far away, Lisa's voice lingered in the wind. Lisa whispered, "Happy anniversary, love." The end. Let's start with the next story. The road stretched endlessly into the night, a narrow ribbon of asphalt swallowed by darkness. The trees lining either side stood tall and motionless, their bare branches reaching like skeletal fingers into the void. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of tires against the cracked pavement. Mark gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles tight. The clock on the dashboard glowed an eerie green, 2:37 a.m. He was exhausted, his body heavy with the weight of the long drive. Mark muttered, "Should have booked a motel." But he knew he wouldn't. He had to get home. His headlights cut through the thick fog rolling across the road, making everything look surreal, dreamlike. The world outside felt empty, abandoned. The further he drove, the more isolated he felt. Then, in the distance, a figure emerged. A man stood on the side of the road, just beyond the reach of the headlights. He was still too still. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, and his face was hidden beneath the hood of a dark sweatshirt. Mark's stomach twisted. He hadn't seen another car for miles. What was this guy doing out here at this hour? Mark slowed the car, his heart pounding. He knew stopping was a bad idea. Every horror story, every urban legend, warned against picking up hitchhikers. But there was something about the way the man stood, something unnatural. He wasn't waving. He wasn't moving. He was just waiting. The car rolled to a stop beside the figure. Mark lowered the window slightly. Cold air seeped in, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic. Mark hesitated, then said, "Need a ride?" The hitchhiker said nothing. Mark frowned. The man's face was still shadowed by the hood, but he could see the pale outline of his jaw. He wasn't looking at Mark. He was staring straight ahead, as if he hadn't heard him. Mark swallowed hard. Mark said, "You okay, man?" The hitchhiker moved. Without a word, he stepped toward the car and opened the passenger door. Mark tensed. The man climbed in, slow and deliberate, then shut the door with a soft click. The air inside the car turned heavy, the temperature dropping instantly. Mark forced a chuckle and said, "Guess that's a yes." The hitchhiker remained silent. Mark's skin prickled. Something felt wrong, but he put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road. The hitchhiker sat stiffly, hands resting on his lap. His face was still hidden beneath the hood, his posture unnaturally rigid. Mark cleared his throat and said, "Where you headed?" No answer. Mark let out a shaky breath. Mark muttered, "Great. One of those types." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Minutes passed. The road twisted through dense woods, the headlights barely cutting through the fog. The trees seemed to press in closer, their gnarled branches reaching toward the car like grasping hands. Mark's fingers drummed against the wheel. Mark forced a grin and said, "All right, man, look. I don't mind giving you a lift, but this silent treatment is weird as hell." The hitchhiker finally moved. Slowly, his head turned toward Mark. Mark felt his stomach drop. The man's had slipped back slightly, revealing his face. But there was nothing there. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just smooth, pale skin. Mark's breath hitched in his throat. His hands clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Mark whispered, "What the hell?" Then, in the mirror, the passenger seat was empty, but the door had never opened. Mark's scream was lost in the roar of the engine. Mark's chest tightened, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His hands trembled on the wheel, but he didn't dare let go. His foot pressed harder on the gas pedal. The car sped forward, the trees blurring past in streaks of black and gray. The seat beside him was empty, but he could still feel it. Something was there. The air inside the car was heavy, thick with something unseen, something watching. His skin prickled as if invisible eyes were crawling over him. Mark whispered, "This isn't real. This isn't real." His knuckles were bloodless against the wheel, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He risked another glance at the mirror. The back seat was empty too. Mark exhaled sharply, his breath shaking. He was alone. Wasn't he? His hands slicked with sweat as he adjusted his grip on the wheel. The road stretched endlessly ahead, swallowed by the mist. He just had to keep driving. He had to get out of here. Then, a whisper, low, garbled, like a voice speaking underwater, right next to his ear. Mark flinched, his shoulder slamming against the door. The car swerved violently, tires screeching against the pavement. He barely managed to yank it back on course, his heart hammering so hard it hurt. Mark shouted, "Who's there?" The whisper stopped. The only sound was his own breathing, ragged and uneven. He forced himself to focus on the road, keep driving, but the dread in his gut only deepened. The highway was wrong. He had been driving for miles, but nothing had changed. The same winding road, the same skeletal trees, the same thick fog pressing against the glass. Like he wasn't going anywhere, like the road wasn't letting him leave. Mark shook his head and muttered, "No, no way. I'm just tired. I need to." A shape appeared ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Mark's foot slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched, the car fishtailing as he struggled to keep control. The figure didn't move. Mark's stomach clenched. It was him, the hitchhiker, standing exactly where Mark had picked him up. Mark gasped, "No, that's not possible." The hitchhiker's hood was still up, his face hidden. His hands hung limply at his sides. But Mark could feel it, that unnatural stillness, that impossible presence. His breathing turned shallow. His hands trembled on the wheel. Then, the hitchhiker's head tilted. Just slightly. Mark's skin crawled. The car was still running, idling in the middle of the road. He could turn around. He could back up and find another way home. But his body wouldn't move. The hitchhiker took a step forward, then another. Mark's breath hitched. The figure was getting closer. One slow, deliberate step at a time. Mark whispered, No. No, no, no. He slammed his foot on the gas. The engine roared, the car lurching forward, straight toward the hitchhiker. But as the headlights washed over him, the figure vanished. Mark's scream caught in his throat. The car sped through empty air, the road stretching out before him as if nothing had ever been there. Mark's hands clenched the wheel so tight his nails dug into his palms. He swallowed thickly, his throat dry as sandpaper. Mark whispered, "This isn't happening. This isn't." A breath, cold and shallow, right behind him. His body went rigid. Something was in the back seat. And this time he wasn't alone. Mark couldn't move. His fingers were locked around the wheel, his body stiff as if frozen in place. The breath behind him was slow, deliberate, too close. His mind screamed at him not to look. Don't look! Don't look! But his body betrayed him. His eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror. And there, the hitchhiker was in the back seat, still hooded, still unmoving. But now, Mark could see something beneath the shadow of the hood. A mouth, too wide, curved into something that might have been a smile, if it weren't so wrong. Mark choked on a gasp, his throat tightening as his pulse roared in his ears. He yanked the wheel, the car swerving violently. The tires screeched against the pavement. The seatbelt dug into his chest as he fought to regain control. When he looked back at the mirror, the hitchhiker was gone. Mark's breath came in shallow bursts, his heart slamming against his ribs. The car sped down the empty highway, swallowed by the endless fog. Mark whispered, "No, no, no." He was losing his mind. He had to be. The road stretched ahead, endless, unchanging. Had he passed this same stretch before? The same gnarled trees? The same broken guardrail? Mark gritted his teeth. No, he wasn't thinking straight. He just had to focus. Get home. Get off this road. Then, a sound, soft at first. A faint click, 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 like fingernails tapping on glass. It was coming from the passenger side window. Mark didn't want to look. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to keep his eyes on the road. But slowly his head turned. A hand, pale, skeletal, pressing against the glass from the outside. Mark shouted, "Jesus Christ!" The car swerved as he jerked away from the window. His pulse thundered as he gripped the wheel, his foot slamming the gas pedal to the floor. But the hand didn't move. It stayed there, pressing against the glass. And then, a second hand, a third, more and more, until the entire window was covered in them. Too many hands, all pressing against the glass, fingers curling, scratching, clawing. Mark's breath came in ragged bursts, his vision blurred with panic. The road was endless. The hands wouldn't stop. And then, a whisper, not behind him, not outside, but inside the car, right next to his ear. Mark shuddered, his body locking up. The voice was hollow, distant, like it had traveled a long way to reach him. The whisper said, "You picked me up." Mark's stomach dropped. No, 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 no. He didn't. He had left the hitchhiker behind. He had seen him vanish in the headlights. But the voice didn't stop. It said, "You picked me up." Mark squeezed his eyes shut. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Leave me alone." The whisper came again. "You picked me up." Mark's head snapped up to the mirror. The back seat was empty, but his gut twisted. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like something was there, like something was waiting. Then, the car radio crackled, static, sharp and shrill, and through the distortion, a voice pushed through. A voice that wasn't his own. It said, "You can't leave." Mark's breath hitched. The road stretched ahead, no end in sight, and deep down, he knew. He wasn't going home. Not tonight. Not ever. Mark's knuckles turned white against the steering wheel. His pulse slammed in his ears. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps. The radio hissed with static. The voice had stopped, but the sound filled the car like a thick fog, pressing into his skull. He twisted the dial, desperate to shut it off. The knob wouldn't turn. Mark muttered, "Come on, come on." A loud pop echoed through the car, and the radio cut to silence. For a moment, all he could hear was the hum of the engine and his own ragged breathing. Then, tap, tap, tap. His stomach clenched. The sound was coming from the windshield. Mark's eyes darted up. A hand. Not just any hand. The hand. The same pale, skeletal fingers that had pressed against the passenger window now rested against the glass in front of him. Mark's breath hitched. His hands trembled on the wheel. Then, another hand, and another, and another. More and more, pressing against the windshield, the side windows, the rear-view mirror. Mark let out a strangled sound, his foot pressing harder on the gas. The speedometer crept higher. The road twisted ahead, vanishing into the fog. He had to get off this highway. He had to get home. Then, a shape, a dark figure standing in the middle of the road. Mark's heart lurched into his throat. The hitchhiker, standing still, unmoving, head slightly tilted. Mark barely had time to react. His instincts screamed, swerve, brake, anything, but his body wouldn't listen. His hands stayed locked on the wheel. His foot stayed firm on the gas. The car was going to hit him. Mark squeezed his eyes shut. Impact, or at least there should have been, but nothing came. The car passed through the figure like mist. Cold flooded the cabin, sinking into Mark's skin. His breath came out in a cloud. Something was in the car with him. A whisper, colder than the grave, slithered into his ear. "You picked me up." Mark's hands jerked the wheel. The car swerved wildly, tires screeching. The world spun. Then, the road disappeared. Mark's stomach flipped as the car crashed through the guardrail. Weightlessness. Then, darkness. Silence. The world was gone. And Mark was falling. A deafening crash shattered the silence. Mark's body jerked forward as the car slammed into something solid. Glass shattered, metal crunched, and for a brief moment, everything was weightless, his limbs flailing, his mind screaming. Then, the impact threw him back into his seat. Pain exploded through his ribs. Darkness swallowed him. For a moment, or maybe an eternity, Mark floated in that abyss. His mind drifted, untethered, lost in the void. Then, a noise. A slow, steady dripping. Water. Mark's eyelids fluttered open. His vision swam. His head throbbed with sharp, pulsing pain. Something warm trickled down his temple. Blood. The world came back into focus in jagged pieces. The windshield was cracked but still intact. A thick fog pressed against the glass. The headlights cut through it weakly, illuminating trees. He had crashed into a ditch just off the highway. Mark groaned, his body protesting as he tried to move. Pain lanced through his side, sharp and deep. Then he heard it, a faint creak, like a car door slowly opening. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He turned his head, ignoring the pain screaming through his skull. The passenger seat was empty. The door hung slightly ajar. His stomach dropped. No. The hitchhiker was gone. Or worse, he was somewhere nearby. Mark's fingers fumbled with his seatbelt. He had to get out. He had to move. Every instinct in his body screamed run. But before he could even unbuckle himself, a voice, right next to his ear. "You shouldn't have left the road." Mark's blood turned to ice. The voice was barely above a whisper, yet it filled the entire car. It came from the passenger seat. Mark's breath hitched. His shaking hand reached for the rearview mirror. Slowly, he angled it toward the passenger seat. His heart stopped. The hitchhiker sat there, his head tilted slightly, his dark, empty eyes locked onto Mark. His face was hollow, drained of life, his mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. But it wasn't just his face. It was the reflection. Because in the mirror, Mark wasn't there. He was gone. The only thing left in the reflection was the hitchhiker, and he was grinning. Mark's breath came in shallow gasps. His chest heaved, his fingers numb against the steering wheel. The reflection in the mirror, that thing, stared back at him with a grin too wide, too unnatural. Mark wrenched his head to the right, expecting to see the hitchhiker still sitting there. The seat was empty, but the moment his eyes flicked back to the mirror, the hitchhiker was still there, watching, smiling. Mark's body trembled. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. His mind had to be playing tricks on him. He squeezed his eyes shut. "Wake up," he whispered to himself. "Wake up!" A deep, slow exhale brushed against his ear. "You're not asleep," the voice murmured. Mark screamed. He scrambled for the door handle, his fingers slipping against the cold metal. He had to get out. He had to run. But the moment he pulled the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. No, worse, the handle wasn't even there anymore. Mark's entire body tensed in terror. He turned wildly, looking at the interior of the car. Everything had changed. The dashboard was warped, the air vents twisted into jagged, gaping holes. The radio flickered erratically, whispering distorted voices in a language he didn't understand. The windshield was covered in thick, dark condensation, like something had breathed heavily against the glass from the inside. And then, the engine roared to life. Mark's foot wasn't on the gas. His hands weren't on the wheel. But the car began to move. Slowly at first, rolling backward out of the ditch. The tires crunched over gravel, the frame of the vehicle groaning like it was alive. The headlights flickered as the fog around them grew thicker, swallowing the road, the trees, everything. Mark tried the door again. It was still gone. His breathing turned frantic. "Let me out," he choked. "Please, let me out." The car didn't stop. It moved faster. The road outside was gone now. There was only darkness. And then the voice returned, softer this time. "You gave me a ride," it whispered. Mark shook his head violently. "No," he gasped. "No, You took me off the road." A sharp, ice-cold hand pressed against his shoulder. Mark went still. He didn't want to look, but he had to. His head turned, inch by inch, his breath frozen in his throat. The hitchhiker was sitting beside him again. But this time, his face wasn't empty. This time, it was Mark's face. Distorted, twisted, a grotesque mockery of himself. "You shouldn't have stopped," the thing said in his own voice. Mark opened his mouth to scream, but the car plunged forward, straight into the void. The last thing he heard was the sound of the door finally unlocking. And then, nothing. Mark's scream never fully formed. The sound was swallowed by the void as the car plummeted into absolute blackness. There was no road, no sky, no trees, just an infinite, suffocating emptiness. Gravity twisted. Up and down no longer made sense. The weight of his own body felt wrong, as if he were falling in every direction at once. His fingers clawed at the dashboard, searching for something, anything to hold on to. The radio crackled. At first, it was just static. Then voices. Picked him up. Never should have stopped. Always looking for another ride. The air inside the car thickened. It pressed against his skin, squeezing his lungs, filling his throat with something heavy and cold. The hitchhiker, the thing wearing his face, watched him unblinking. Its mouth stretched open wider and wider until its jaw cracked and unhinged like a snake's. "You took my place," it whispered. The headlights flickered wildly. The windshield warped, bending inward as if something massive was pressing against it from the other side. Shapes moved in the dark. Twisted hands scraped at the glass. Mark thrashed. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from his chest. "What do you want?" he cried. The hitchhiker smiled. And then, it was gone. Just like that, the weight on Mark's chest vanished. The air cleared. The blackness outside the car dissolved like mist. Suddenly, he was back on the road. The car skidded wildly, tires screeching against the pavement. Mark yanked the wheel. barely managing to swerve back onto the highway. His breaths came fast and shallow. His pulse hammered in his ears. He was driving again. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet. The trees lined both sides of the highway, just as they had before. The dashboard was normal, the windshield clear. It was as if nothing had happened. But Mark knew. Something had happened. His hands shook as he reached for his phone. He needed to call someone, anyone. Tell them what he had seen, what had almost happened to him. But when he glanced at the rearview mirror, his reflection wasn't there. Mark's stomach dropped. He whipped his head around, looking into the back seat. It was empty. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned back to the mirror. Still nothing. His hands tightened around the wheel. His breath came in shallow gasps. And then, the radio crackled again. A voice, his own voice, whispered through the static. "Need a ride?" The engine sputtered. The lights flickered. The road ahead began to blur, twisting into something unfamiliar. And then, the car kept driving. But this time, Mark wasn't the one behind the wheel. Let's start with the next story. The attic smelled of dust and time. Old cardboard boxes, worn with age, sat stacked in uneven piles. The single light bulb flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the wooden beams. Emily brushed a cobweb off her sleeve and sighed. Her mother had insisted she take some of her old belongings before they sold the house. She hadn't been back in years, not since she left for college, not since she put the past behind her. She opened a box labeled Emily's Childhood in her mother's neat handwriting. Inside were faded picture books, a few stuffed animals, and old drawings she barely remembered making. Then, buried beneath a pile of clothes, she saw it. A small rabbit plushie, its fur once white, but now a dull gray. One of its button eyes was loose, dangling by a thread. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Benny," she whispered. She hadn't thought about Benny in years. Her fingers trembled as she picked him up. His tiny stitched mouth curved into the same crooked smile she remembered. She had loved this toy as a child, slept with him every night, told him all her secrets. But she also remembered the nightmares, dark dreams she could never quite explain, the whispers, the feeling that someone was always listening. Emily shook her head. That was just childhood imagination. She held Benny close and carried him downstairs. Maybe it was silly, but something about him still made her feel safe. That night, as she lay in bed, she placed Benny on the nightstand beside her. The house was quiet. Only the distant ticking of a clock filled the space. Just as she was drifting off, a sound made her freeze. A soft, scratchy whisper. "Emily, I missed you." Her eyes shot open. The room was dark. Benny sat exactly where she had left him. Still, silent. Had she imagined it? Her heart pounded in her chest. She reached out and hesitantly picked up the rabbit. It was just a toy, just fabric and stuffing. She let out a shaky breath. "I'm losing it," Emily muttered, setting Benny back down. She turned over, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. She needed sleep. Then, just as she closed her eyes, she heard it again. A soft, breathy giggle, right next to her ear. Emily's blood ran cold. She wasn't imagining things. Benny was laughing. Emily shot up in bed, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She grabbed Benny with shaking hands and held him at arm's length. The stuffed rabbit dangled limply, its loose button eye swaying slightly. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." It had to be her imagination. She was exhausted, stressed. The attic, the memories, it was all getting to her. But deep inside, something told her she wasn't imagining things. She set Benny back down on the nightstand, turning him away so he wasn't facing her. The thought made her feel stupid. It was just a toy, just fabric and stuffing. Emily lay back down, pulling the covers over her shoulders. She closed her eyes, willing sleep to take her. Minutes passed. Then, tap, tap, tap. Her eyes flew open. The sound was soft but deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the nightstand. Emily turned her head slowly, dread curling around her like a cold hand. Benny was sitting upright, facing her. Her throat tightened. She was sure, absolutely sure, that she had left him facing away. A sickening chill crept down her spine. "I need to get rid of you," she whispered. She grabbed Benny and shoved him into the drawer of her nightstand, slamming it shut. For a long time, she lay in the darkness, listening. Silence. She exhaled shakily and forced herself to relax. It was fine. It was over. Then, scratch, scratch, scratch. From inside the drawer, Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. The sound was light, almost hesitant, like tiny fingers scraping against the wood. She gritted her teeth and clenched her fists. "It's not real," she muttered. "It's not real." The scratching stopped. Silence stretched through the room. Then, through the stillness, a whisper seeped from the drawer. "You don't get to forget me." Emily leapt out of bed, her skin crawling. She backed away, her legs shaking beneath her. The drawer creaked. Slowly. It slid open. An inch. Then two. Darkness gaped inside. And then, Benny's head peeked out. Emily screamed. Emily stumbled back, her breath ragged, her heart slamming against her ribs. The dim glow from the street lamp outside barely illuminated her room, but it was enough to see Benny sitting there in the open drawer. His head was tilted slightly. His one button eye gleamed in the darkness. He hadn't been like that before. She wanted to run, out of the room, out of the house, but her legs refused to move. "This isn't real," she whispered. "This isn't real." Benny moved. Just a slight shift, barely noticeable, but Emily saw it. The stuffed rabbit's head jerked a fraction to the side, like it was listening. A sob caught in her throat. She was losing it. This had to be a dream, a terrible, vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But then Benny spoke again, his voice soft, like a breath of air seeping through the cracks of a door. "Do you remember what you did?" Emily's knees buckled, and she gripped the wall to steady herself. "No," she choked out. I don't know what you mean." A pause. Then, "Liar." The whisper slithered through the room, seeping into her skin like ice water. Benny fell forward out of the drawer and landed on the floor with a soft thud. Emily sucked in a sharp breath. She needed to get rid of him. Now. She forced herself forward, snatching the stuffed rabbit up with trembling fingers. The fabric felt cold, too cold, against her skin. She sprinted down the hallway, down the stairs, barely able to see in the dark. The house felt suffocating, like the walls were pressing in on her. She reached the front door, fumbled with the locks, and wrenched it open. The night air hit her like a slap. Without thinking, she hurled Benny onto the porch and slammed the door shut. Silence. Emily pressed her back against the wood, panting. She squeezed her eyes shut. It was over. It had to be over. But then, a faint thump against the door. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Then another, and another. Thump, thump, thump. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate, like tiny hands knocking. "Let me in," Benny whispered from the other side. Emily clapped a hand over her mouth, stifling a scream. Then, the doorknob began to turn. Emily's breath hitched as the doorknob rattled violently. The metal twisted left, then right, then back again, as if small, unseen hands were testing the lock. "No, no, no," she whispered, stumbling backward, her pulse hammering. A chilling giggle seeped through the door, soft, childlike, yet distorted, as if spoken from a throat too small to carry a voice. Then the knocking stopped. Silence stretched across the room. Emily held her breath, waiting. Nothing. Maybe it was over. Maybe Benny was gone. She took a cautious step forward, then another. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the peephole. She had to see, had to know. She hesitated, then pressed her eye against the glass. The porch was empty. No sign of Benny. The toy was gone. Relief flooded her, making her knees weak. She backed away from the door, shaking her head. Maybe she had imagined it all. Maybe stress and exhaustion were warping her mind. A nervous laugh escaped her lips. "Get a grip, Emily," she muttered, dragging a hand through her hair. She turned, ready to head back upstairs. And then, her blood ran cold. Benny sat on the hallway floor, right behind her. His small, stuffed arms rested neatly in his lap. His single button. I stared up at her. Emily's stomach lurched. "How?" she gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. The front door was still locked. She had thrown him outside. She had seen the porch. He hadn't been there. How was he inside? Her feet refused to move. Benny tilted his head. "You can't leave me," he whispered. "Not again." Emily's vision blurred with panic. She turned and bolted up the stairs, her heart slamming against her ribs. She didn't stop until she reached her bedroom, slamming the door shut behind her. Her hands fumbled for the lock. She twisted it, sealing herself inside. Her lungs burned, her body trembling. She was losing her mind. She backed away from the door, chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. A faint shuffle came from the hallway. Then, soft footsteps. Tiny, light, moving toward her door. They stopped just outside. Then a single knock. Emily squeezed her eyes shut. "Go away," she choked. Silence. Then, from the other side of the door, "Do you remember what you did?" Her stomach twisted into knots. "I don't know," she cried. "I don't know what you're talking about." A pause. Then Benny whispered, "I'll help you remember." And the lock clicked open. Emily stumbled backward as the lock slid open on its own. "No, no, no," she whispered, pressing herself against the far wall. The door creaked, inching open with an agonizing slowness. A shadow stretched across the floor. Then, soft footsteps. Benny stepped inside, not walking, not being dragged. He simply moved. His stubby, stuffed legs did not bend, but somehow he advanced toward her. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps. "Stay away from me," she pleaded, pressing her hands to the wall behind her as if she could disappear into it. Benny tilted his head. "You don't remember," he whispered, almost sad. "But I do." Emily shook her head violently. "I don't know what you're talking about." Benny took another step. "You were my best friend," he said. "We played together. We laughed together." And then, a pause. Then his tiny stuffed hand moved. He lifted it, pointed at her. "You buried me." Emily's stomach twisted. Her mind screamed, "No, no, no, this isn't real." Memories tugged at the edges of her consciousness. Flashes of something long forgotten. Her childhood backyard. The old oak tree. A small pair of hands digging into the dirt. Her hands. Her heart pounded. "That's not true," she gasped. "You're just a toy." Benny's button eye gleamed. "Am I?" The walls of the room shuddered. The air grew thick, suffocating. A whisper slithered through the air, not from Benny's stitched mouth, but from everywhere. "Dig, dig, dig." Emily pressed her hands to her ears, but the word pulsed through her skull. Then, a sharp pain stabbed through her mind. A memory surfaced. Not a dream, not a trick, a real memory. She saw herself, younger, 8 years old, clutching Benny tight, sobbing. A voice, her father's voice, boomed in the background. "You're too old for that thing, Emily. Throw it out." She had screamed, clutching Benny tighter. "No, please. He's mine. I love him." Her father's face twisted in anger. He snatched the toy from her arms. "Grow up." Emily's little body had shaken with rage. And then, she had taken Benny back, run outside, dug a hole beneath the oak tree, and shoved him inside. Her tiny hands had piled dirt over him, sobbing the whole time. "I'll come back for you," she had whispered. But she never did. Her childhood ended. Her love for Benny faded. And he had waited. The memory snapped away like a rubber band. Emily's breath hitched. She stared at Benny, who stood in the center of the room, watching her, waiting. "You left me in the dark," he whispered. "But I never left you." Emily's hands trembled. I didn't mean to," she choked out. Benny tilted his head the other way. "It's okay," he said. "We can be together now." Emily's skin turned cold. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Benny took another step toward her. "Come back with me," he said. Emily's body stiffened. "Back where?" Benny's button eye glinted. "Back to the dark." The floor trembled beneath her feet. The room warped, shadows stretching toward her like hungry fingers. And then, the walls began to close in. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as the walls crept closer. The shadows stretched, thick and oily, swallowing the edges of the room. "Stop, please," she cried, pressing herself against the shrinking space. Benny took another step. "You left me," he whispered. "Now you'll stay with me forever." The walls groaned, pressing inward. The air grew thick, suffocating. Emily's ears rang with an eerie, distant humming, like a lullaby warped and distorted beyond recognition. She squeezed her eyes shut. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But then, a hand touched her wrist. Emily's eyes flew open. Benny's tiny plush fingers curled around her arm. She screamed. His grip was ice cold, not soft like fabric, but solid, unyielding. "Don't be afraid," Benny cooed, his button eye reflecting her terrified face. "It will only hurt for a moment." Emily thrashed, trying to pull away, but Benny's grip tightened. Then, the floor vanished beneath her. She plunged into the darkness. The world turned cold, silent. Her stomach lurched as she fell, deeper and deeper into the void. The shadows wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. Then suddenly, she hit solid ground. A soft thud. Pain shot up her legs, but it wasn't the agony of breaking bones. It was something worse, something wrong. Emily groaned and tried to move, but her body felt unnatural. She lifted her arms. No, not arms. Stitched fabric, tiny plush fingers, button eyes. Her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps, but there was no breath. No heartbeat, no warmth. She was small, stuffed, trapped. A new voice echoed above her, distant yet familiar. A child's voice. "Oh wow, look at this one." Emily tried to scream, but her mouth was stitched shut. Soft, chubby hands lifted her into the air. A giggle. "I'll take this one, Daddy." The child's voice was excited, full of wonder. "That's a good choice," a deeper voice said. "It looks just like your mommy's old toy, Benny." Emily's button eyes stared ahead. She couldn't move, couldn't fight. She was just a toy. And as she was carried away, she felt it, a presence beside her. Tiny, plush fingers reached for hers. A whisper close to her ear. "I told you," Benny murmured. "Now we'll be together forever." And deep inside her silent, frozen mind, Emily screamed. Let's start with the next story. The old cookbook smelled like dust and something faintly sweet, like cinnamon left too long in the air. Clara found it buried at the bottom of a box in her late grandmother's attic, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white but had aged into a dull yellow. She traced her fingers over the cracked leather cover, the gold lettering long faded. Clara said, "Grandma never let anyone touch this book. She said some recipes weren't meant to be made anymore." Her friend Daniel, who had followed her up to the attic, scoffed. Daniel said, "Come on, Clara. It's just a cookbook, probably full of old-fashioned junk." She wasn't so sure. As she opened it, the pages crackled, delicate and brittle under her fingers. The writing was in her grandmother's careful cursive, with notes scrawled in the margins. Some of the ink had smeared over time, as if touched with damp fingers. Most of the recipes were ordinary, honey cakes, spiced bread, sugared plums. But then she reached the final pages. There, a recipe was written in ink so dark it looked fresh, as if someone had written it just yesterday. The forgotten recipe. Beneath the title, There were no measurements, only vague instructions. Mix the flour, but not too much. Let the dough rest, but not too long. Add the secret ingredient when the time is right. Clara frowned. There was no secret ingredient listed. She said, "This is weird. Why didn't she write it all down?" Daniel leaned over her shoulder, peering at the page. Daniel said, "Maybe she just forgot. Or maybe it's one of those things where only family members know. Like a tradition." Something about it unsettled Clara, but the curiosity was stronger. She had inherited her grandmother's bakery, a struggling little shop downtown that needed something new to draw people in. What if this was it? That night, she set to work in the bakery's kitchen. The air was warm, filled with the scent of sugar and yeast. She followed the vague instructions as best as she could. The dough was soft, pliant, but something about it felt off. It was too smooth, too perfect. It almost felt alive under her hands. Clara said, "It's just dough. Stop being ridiculous." She placed it in the oven, the heat filling the kitchen. As the minutes ticked by, an unfamiliar aroma filled the space. It wasn't just sweet, it was intoxicating, rich, something that made her stomach twist with hunger. When she pulled the finished pastry from the oven, it was beautiful. The crust was golden, the inside fluffy and light. It smelled like every childhood memory she had forgotten, like warm afternoons in her grandmother's kitchen, like laughter and safety. Without thinking, she tore off a piece and popped it into her mouth. The flavor exploded across her tongue, perfect in every way. She sighed, closing her eyes. It was like nothing she had ever tasted before. The next morning, Clara brought the pastries to the shop. The moment she placed them in the display case, customers were drawn to them. They sniffed the air, their eyes lighting up as if remembering something they had lost. One man took a bite and let out a shaky breath. The man said, This tastes like my childhood, like something I can't quite remember." A woman wiped her eyes. The woman said, "It's perfect, like a dream I just woke up from." Word spread fast. Within days, the bakery had lines out the door. Clara baked batch after batch, exhaustion creeping into her bones, but she couldn't stop. Every time she tried to make something else, customers asked for that pastry. And then she started noticing changes. People who ate the pastries came back. Every day. Their eyes had a glassy, hungry look. They didn't just want the pastries, they needed them. Some stood outside the bakery before she even opened, staring through the glass. Others didn't speak anymore, only pointing at the display with trembling hands. And then there was Clara herself. She couldn't stop eating them. At first, it was just a taste here and there. Then whole pastries at a time. But it wasn't enough. A deep hunger gnawed at her, something more than normal cravings. One night, as she licked the last crumbs from her fingers, she noticed something strange on her hands. Dark specks, like dried blood. Her stomach lurched. Where had that come from? She hadn't cut herself. Had she? She ran to the cookbook, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. She landed on the forgotten recipe again. There, beneath the original instructions, new words had appeared. The secret ingredient reveals itself when the hunger begins. Clara's breath hitched. The ink was still wet. Clara staggered back, the cookbook slipping from her hands and landing on the counter with a dull thud. The ink on the page gleamed under the dim kitchen light, as if it had been written only moments ago. Her heart pounded in her chest. She whispered, "This wasn't here before." The words seemed to pulse, dark and alive. She wiped her hands on her apron, but the dark specks remained. She turned to the sink, scrubbing her fingers under hot water, but no matter how hard she rubbed, the stains wouldn't fade. The hunger gnawed at her. Deep in her stomach, a twisting need coiled tighter. She had eaten 3 pastries that night, yet she still felt empty, like something inside her was reaching for more. Her throat was dry, her skin prickling with a heat that made her shiver. A knock sounded at the bakery door. Clara jumped, nearly slipping on the tiled floor. She turned toward the front of the shop. The lights were off, the closed sign clearly displayed. But someone was standing outside, their shadow stretching long against the glass. Another knock, this time more forceful. A voice whispered through the door. The voice said, "Clara, are there any left?" She knew that voice. It was Mrs. Holloway, a regular customer. But something about her tone was wrong, thin and shaking, as if it were being pulled from deep within her throat. Clara called out, "We're closed. Come back tomorrow." Silence. Then, nails scraped against the glass. Mrs. Holloway said, "Please, I need more." Clara's breath hitched. She took a slow step back, heart thudding so hard she felt it in her fingertips. The scratching at the door didn't stop. It grew more frantic, more desperate. Mrs. Holloway whispered, "I can't taste anything else anymore. Please, Clara, just one more." A sick realization dawned on Clara. These pastries weren't just good. They were addicting. People weren't just craving them. They were dependent on them. She grabbed the cookbook with trembling hands, flipping the page. She needed answers. And there, at the bottom of the recipe, more words had appeared. "You are the baker now. The hunger is yours to feed." Clara shook her head, her breath quick and shallow. No, this wasn't possible. This wasn't real. The knocking at the door stopped. Clara's head snapped up. Mrs. Holloway was no longer there. The street was empty, but something else had changed. Through the glass, in the reflection, Clara saw the bakery behind her, the ovens, the shelves, the empty display case. But her reflection wasn't right. She was standing still, but her reflection was smiling. A wide, hungry smile. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her reflection's grin stretched too wide, teeth gleaming like polished bone. Her own lips weren't moving, yet the thing in the glass grinned back at her, as if sharing a secret only it understood. She stumbled away from the door, knocking over a tray of flour-dusted dough. The metal clattered against the counter, breaking the silence. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She whispered, "This isn't real." But the hunger twisting inside her stomach told her otherwise. The cookbook lay open on the counter. The ink on the page seemed darker now, the words shifting like something alive. Clara forced herself to look at the next line beneath the recipe. The first taste binds the soul. The second awakens the hunger. The third feeds the others. Her stomach clenched. The warmth in her body, the dryness in her throat, the strange way her skin prickled, it all made sense now. She wasn't just making food. She was changing. A sharp knock echoed from the back door. Clara spun around. The alley entrance. No one ever used it except for deliveries, and no shipments were scheduled this late. But something or someone was there. Another knock. Slow, deliberate. Clara's hands trembled as she stepped toward the door. The hunger inside her sharpened. The scent of her own pastries lingered in the air, sweet and intoxicating, but it wasn't enough anymore. The voice on the other side of the door rasped, "You've fed them. Now who will feed you?" Clara's skin went cold. The voice wasn't human. It was low and guttural, like something ancient speaking through broken teeth. She backed away, but the hunger surged, stronger than before. Her stomach ached, her vision blurred. She gripped the edge of the counter, her nails digging into the wood. The cookbook fluttered open to another page. There, scrawled at the bottom in her grandmother's unmistakable handwriting, was a final warning. You cannot stop now. The hunger does not leave. It only waits. Clara's breath came in short gasps. She was trapped. The pastries had bound her to something she didn't understand. And no matter how much she ate, no matter how much she tried to satisfy it, it would never be enough. The knocking stopped. Silence pressed against Clara's ears, thick and suffocating. She dared not move, her fingers still gripping the counter. Her stomach twisted again, a deep, clawing ache that made her double over. It wasn't hunger as she knew it. It was something else, something alive. The cookbook sat open, the pages curling at the edges. The ink seemed darker, the words shifting under the dim kitchen light. Clara forced herself to read the next line beneath her grandmother's warning. The hunger will shape you. The craving will change you. If you resist, you will belong to them. Her breath hitched. A low creak sounded behind her. The alley door. She turned slowly, her hands clammy, her legs trembling beneath her weight. The door hadn't opened, but something had stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of warm bread, sugar, and something else. Something rancid, like meat left out too long. A shadow stretched across the floor, long and twisted, pooling toward her feet. She whispered, "Who's there?" The shadow moved. A figure took shape, emerging from the dim light near the door. At first, she thought it was a man, tall, draped in tattered cloth, with limbs too thin, fingers too long. But then she saw its face. It had no eyes, only deep, hollow pits where eyes should be, and a mouth that stretched too wide, filled with jagged, blackened teeth. It rasped, "You called us." Clara's chest tightened. The thing tilted its head, as if studying her. Then it took a step forward, the floor creaking beneath its weight. "You ate. Now you belong." Her body seized with cold terror. She backed up, her hips slamming into the counter. A knife rested beside the mixing bowl, gleaming under the dim kitchen light. She snatched it up, her knuckles white as she held it in front of her. The thing laughed. It was a dry, brittle sound, like leaves crumbling to dust. "That will not help you now." The hunger inside her surged, unbearable now, a writhing, clawing need that made her shake. Her throat burned. Her skin tingled. The smell of her own pastries, the scent of warm flesh, made her mouth water. She whispered, "What's happening to me?" The thing grinned wider. "You are becoming." Clara's breath came in ragged gasps. She could feel it, the shift inside her, the way her body no longer felt like her own. Her hands trembled. Her stomach lurched. The hunger wasn't just inside her. It was her, and it was only getting stronger. Clara staggered backward, her vision swimming. Her body burned with a feverish hunger that twisted her insides, making her hands shake violently. The knife felt heavier now, slick in her grip as her palms grew damp with sweat. The creature, if it was even a creature, stepped closer, the shadows clinging to its form like living things. Its grin never faltered, those blackened teeth gleaming under the dim kitchen light. "You feel it now, don't you?" it rasped. Clara shook her head, squeezing her eyes shut. No, this isn't real." The hunger inside her pulsed in response, a deep, gnawing ache that nearly brought her to her knees. She could smell the pastries on the counter, but they no longer smelled sweet. They smelled alive. The scent curled in her nostrils, thick and cloying, making her stomach tighten with unbearable craving. She swallowed hard. "What did I eat?" she whispered. The thing chuckled, stepping closer, its movements unnatural, too smooth, too silent. "Not just food," it murmured. "A memory, a life, a piece of something much older than you." Clara's stomach twisted violently. She doubled over, gasping, her free hand gripping the edge of the counter. She could feel something inside her shifting. Her skin tingled, too tight over her bones. Her teeth ached. Her breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. "Make it stop," she begged. The thing loomed over her now, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. "You cannot stop it," it said. "You are one of us now." Clara's grip tightened on the knife. "I am not like you," she hissed. The thing leaned closer. Its breath smelled of rot and something old, something damp and forgotten. "Aren't you?" it whispered. Clara's stomach lurched violently, a raw, unbearable hunger flooding her senses. Her head snapped toward the counter, toward the pastries, the scent overwhelming now. She could hear them, soft whispers, writhing beneath the golden crust, something alive just beneath the surface. Her hands trembled. Her breath hitched. She wanted to run, but the hunger wanted to consume. Clara clutched the counter, her breath shallow and uneven. The whispers from the pastries were growing louder, slithering into her ears like a parasite burrowing deep. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing them to stop. "You're fighting it," the thing said, amused. "But why? You already took the first bite. You let it in." Clara shook her head violently. "I didn't know," she gasped. The thing chuckled, stepping even closer. It was at her back now, so near that she could feel the cold press of its presence against her spine. "Ignorance doesn't make you innocent," it murmured. "You fed on the past, on something meant to stay forgotten, and now it feeds on you." Clara's stomach clenched. The hunger was unbearable now. She could taste it, thick on her tongue, as if something was growing inside her, something ancient. Her fingers twitched toward the pastries. "No." She clenched her fist, forcing herself to step back, forcing herself to resist. "I won't eat any more," she said through gritted teeth. The thing laughed, the sound sharp and hollow. "Oh, but you will," it whispered. A sharp pain shot through Clara's stomach. She cried out, doubling over as a deep, primal hunger clawed at her insides. It wasn't just a craving anymore. It was need. She gasped, pressing a trembling hand to her stomach. Something inside her moved. Terror shot through her veins. She stumbled back, knocking into the kitchen table. The pastries trembled slightly, as if they could sense her hesitation. The whispers grew urgent. "Eat," they murmured. "No," Clara choked out. She turned, gripping the knife in her hand, raising it toward the thing behind her. "What did I eat?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The thing's grin widened, splitting its face in a grotesque, jagged smile. "A recipe," it said. "Not for food. For remembrance. For resurrection." Clara's blood turned to ice. "You mean?" The thing nodded slowly. "You didn't just bake something," it whispered. "You woke something." The kitchen flickered around her, the walls seeming to darken, pulse. The air thickened, heavy with something unseen. Clara's heart pounded. She wasn't hungry. She was becoming something else. Clara staggered backward, the knife shaking in her grip. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the room twisted around her. The walls seemed to breathe, the air thick with the scent of warm sugar and something rotten beneath it. "You feel it, don't you?" the thing whispered, stepping closer. "It's inside you now, growing, changing you." Clara pressed a hand to her stomach, panic rising in her throat. Her skin was hot, feverish, as if something were burning beneath the surface. "I won't let this happen," she gasped. The thing laughed, the sound crawling under her skin. "You think you have a choice?" it sneered. "The moment you tasted it, the moment you fed, you became part of it. Part of us." Clara's knees buckled, and she collapsed against the table. Her fingers clenched the edge, her vision swimming. The hunger was unbearable now, a gnawing, insatiable need. She turned her head, her gaze falling upon the tray of pastries. They pulsed. The golden crusts cracked, splitting open like wounds. A dark, glistening substance oozed out, writhing like something alive. It smelled sweet, intoxicating. It called to her, whispered her name. "Eat," the voices urged. "Finish what you started." Clara clenched her teeth, shaking her head violently. "No," she rasped. The thing tilted its head, watching her with cold amusement. "You can fight it," it said. "But the hunger always wins." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, her body trembling. The pain in her stomach twisted, sharpened, and she felt it then, something inside her, something wrong. It wasn't just hunger. It was growing. Her eyes snapped open in horror. "What did I become?" she whispered. The thing's grin widened. "You'll see soon enough." Clara clutched her stomach, a sickening heat rolling through her veins. The hunger was no longer just a craving. It was something deeper, something that clawed at her from the inside. Her fingers dug into her skin as if she could tear it out, rip free from whatever was taking root inside her. The thing stepped closer, its voice low and almost tender. "It doesn't have to be painful," it murmured. "Embrace it. You were always meant for this." Clara shook her head violently. "No, I didn't ask for this," she gasped. "Didn't you?" the thing asked. You went looking for the recipe. You made the dish. You fed them. A fresh wave of nausea hit her as memories rushed forward. The way her customers had eaten with such desperation, the way their eyes had darkened, how their bodies had twitched slightly as they left the shop. She hadn't just served them. She had changed them. Her breath hitched. "What happens to them?" she whispered. The thing smiled. "You already know." A sharp knock echoed from the front of the bakery. Clara jerked upright, her heart hammering. Another knock, then another, and then the voices. "Clara, we're hungry. Feed us." She stumbled back as the knocking turned into pounding, the door rattling against its frame. Shadows loomed against the frosted glass, their shapes twitching, shifting. Her customers. She had done this to them, and they had come back for more. Clara's legs buckled, and she sank to the floor, her vision swimming as the voices grew louder, more insistent. They had always come for the bread, the pastries, the sweet delights that had once made her shop a success. But now it wasn't just food they craved. It was something else, something darker. She felt a sickening pull inside her, a weight settling deep in her chest, as if something had latched onto her very soul. The kitchen was silent now, save for the soft, steady hum of the oven in the background. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for the cookbook, flipping through the pages. She had to stop. She had to destroy the recipe, erase whatever evil had been baked into it. She knew she was too late, though. The hunger had already taken root in her. It was too powerful to stop now. "Clara." The voice echoed again, and this time it was unmistakable. One of the familiar faces from the shop, grinning through the glass, eyes hollow and dark. The bakery had been their trap, and now it was hers as well. The door creaked open, and Clara could only watch in numb horror as they filed in, their features shifting between the men and women they once were, their eyes glowing with something inhuman. She had fed them, and now they were here for the final serving. The thing in the back of her mind whispered once more, "Embrace it, Clara. It's who you are." She looked at the glowing oven, her reflection flickering in the glass. Her skin had paled, her eyes sunken. She didn't recognize herself anymore. The desire for more of the recipe, more of the hunger, was unbearable. And as the line of customers reached the counter, one by one, they stood silently, waiting for her to give them what they wanted, what they needed, and she would. With a trembling hand, Clara reached for the mixing bowl. The flour, sugar, and eggs felt like nothing more than weights in her hands. She would bake again, but this time it would be different. This time, the recipe would demand its payment, and there would be no going back. Clara's mind raced, her fingers trembling as they worked with the dough, the same rhythmic motions that had once brought comfort. But now, every movement felt wrong. The weight of the recipe pressed heavily on her, the voices louder, urging her to finish what she had started. She could feel the transformation beginning, not just in her body, but in her very essence. There was no escape now. The customers stood in a silent, almost trance-like line, their eyes unblinking as they waited for her to serve them. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel it, the pull of something ancient and dark inside her. She had fed them, and now they fed on her. There was no way out. She knew what she had to do. She had to keep baking, keep feeding the hunger. Her breath caught in her throat as she took the first bite of the bread she had created. The warmth spread through her like wildfire, a sensation both pleasurable and terrifying. She felt the recipe take root inside her. It was too late. She could already see it, the same hollow eyes, the same twisted smiles, all pointing back at her. They were here for her now. The cycle would never end. And as the door to the bakery slammed shut, sealing her fate, Clara whispered into the silence, "What have I become?" The oven continued to hum softly. The voices, always hungry, always waiting, would never stop. Let's start with the next story. The Holloways had always dreamed of this moment, finally moving into their perfect home. The house was everything they had imagined, spacious, with a large garden, high ceilings, and big windows that let in the soft morning sunlight. It was in a quiet neighborhood, just far enough from the bustling city, but close enough for convenience. For Sam, Megan, and their young son Ben, this was their new beginning, the life they had worked so hard to build. Megan stood at the front door, staring at the house. It looked almost too perfect, as though it had been waiting for them. Sam came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice warm and excited. She smiled and leaned back into him. "It's everything we wanted. It feels right." Ben ran past them, his laughter echoing as he dashed toward the garden. He was excited, his eyes wide with wonder. "Look, Mom! Look, Dad! A tree!" he shouted, pointing at the large oak tree in the middle of the yard. Megan laughed and nodded. "That's right, buddy. It's all yours now." They moved in that day, unpacking boxes and placing their things in the large rooms. The furniture was arranged, the kitchen organized, and within hours the house felt warm with their presence. It was everything they had dreamed of and more. That night, as the family sat down to dinner, Sam couldn't shake a strange feeling. It wasn't exactly fear, more like a deep sense of unease. Something about the house didn't sit right with him, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The walls were silent, the air still. Even Ben seemed to sense it, his eyes darting nervously toward the dark corners of the room. "Dad, is someone here?" Ben asked, his voice small, almost as if he were afraid to speak too loudly. Sam frowned, looking at Ben. "What do you mean, buddy?" Ben shrugged and looked away, his face scrunched in confusion. "I thought I heard someone whispering." Megan glanced around the room, her face showing a flicker of worry. "It's probably just the house settling. Old houses do that." But even as she spoke, Megan felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Something was off. The house wasn't settling, it was something else. She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. It had to be her imagination. After all, they had just moved in. Later that evening, as they all sat down to watch TV, the air in the room seemed to grow colder. Ben had long since fallen asleep on the couch, his head resting against his mother's lap. Megan absent-mindedly stroked his hair as Sam scrolled through his phone. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking through the house. Sam looked up sharply. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tight. Megan nodded, her heart beginning to race. "Yes, I did." Ben stirred in his sleep, his eyes flickering open. "Mom? Dad?" he whispered, looking around the room in confusion. "It's okay, sweetie," Megan said, trying to sound reassuring, though her voice wavered slightly. "Just go back to sleep." But the sound of footsteps continued, growing louder, as though someone was moving closer to the living room. Megan stood up, holding Ben protectively in her arms. "I'll go check," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Sam didn't argue. He followed her as she made her way into the hallway. The house was eerily silent now, the air thick with an unsettling presence. They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled on the old hardwood floors. As they reached the foot of the stairs, they both froze. At the top of the stairs, standing in the shadows, was a figure. The figure was tall and thin, their face hidden by the dark of the hallway. For a moment, Megan thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but then the figure slowly took a step forward. "Who's there?" Sam called out, his voice sharp with panic. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took another step, its movements unnatural and slow, as though it didn't belong to the house. Megan clutched Ben tighter to her chest, her pulse quickening. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the darkness. Sam and Megan exchanged a terrified glance. "Did you see that?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Megan nodded. "Yes." They stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. The air felt thick, suffocating. Then they heard something else, whispers, faint but distinct, like voices coming from all around them. Megan's breath hitched in her throat. and she turned to Sam. "We need to get out of here." But before they could move, the whispers grew louder, filling the entire house. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on them. Suddenly, Ben screamed. Megan turned, her heart racing as she saw Ben standing at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes wide with terror. "Mom! Dad! There's someone upstairs!" Without thinking, Megan rushed to Ben, her legs shaking with every step. She gathered him in her arms, holding him tightly against her chest. Sam moved to the stairs, trying to steady himself against the overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to fill the house. "We need to leave," Sam said, his voice shaky. "Now!" But as he turned to lead the way out, a loud crash came from upstairs. It was followed by the sound of something, or someone, moving through the house with unnerving speed. Megan looked at Sam in fear. "We can't leave." "Not yet." "What do you mean, Megan?" "We're getting out of here now." But Megan's face was pale, her eyes wide with realization. "It's not just the house, Sam. It's the people who used to live here. They never left." Ben clung to his mother, his small body trembling with fear. "Mom, I don't want to stay here anymore." Megan didn't know what to say. All she could do was hold him close, her mind racing as the whispers continued, growing louder and more frantic. Something was coming for them, something that had never left. The family rushed to the front door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door wouldn't budge. Sam yanked on it, his panic rising, but the door remained locked, as if it were refusing to let them escape. Megan's mind raced. "We have to find another way out," she said, her voice trembling. She glanced up at the staircase, where the shadows seemed to move and shift. There was someone up there. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of footsteps, faint, slow, but drawing closer. Something was moving toward them. Megan's heart pounded in her chest. She knew it was too late. The house had claimed them. The whispers had led them here, and now there was no escaping the wrong house. Sam's grip tightened on the door handle as he yanked harder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Come on," he muttered, panic tightening his chest. He didn't know how much longer they could stay in this house. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating them. Megan stood at his side, holding Ben tightly, her eyes darting nervously from the door to the shadows at the top of the stairs. She could feel it, a presence, something in the house that wasn't just a figment of their imagination. It was real, and it was watching them. Finally, the door gave way with a groan, but before they could step outside, something froze them in place. A voice, low and distorted, whispered through the walls, so soft it was almost a sigh. "You're not going anywhere." Megan's blood ran cold. She turned to Sam, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you hear that?" Sam didn't answer. His eyes were wide with fear, his body trembling as he looked at the staircase. A dark shape loomed at the top of the stairs, and though it was obscured by the shadows, they could both feel its presence. Someone was standing there waiting. Ben's grip on his mother's shirt tightened. "Mom, I'm scared. Please, don't let them get me." Megan's heart ached at the fear in her son's voice, but there was nothing she could do. They were trapped. The house wasn't going to let them leave, and the shadows were closing in. Sam stepped back from the door, his eyes glued to the figure at the top of the stairs. "We need to find another way out," he said, his voice hoarse. "Quick, look around the house." They moved away from the door, trying to stay as far from the stairs as possible. The house was large, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift with every step they took. Every corner seemed to hide something, and the deeper they went into the house, the more oppressive the air became. The whispers followed them, louder now, more distinct. They could hear the words clearly, though they made no sense. "Leave, leave, leave," the voices murmured over and over. Megan tried to ignore the chilling sensation crawling up her spine. "This is insane," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Keep moving," Sam urged, trying to stay calm. He pushed open a door at the end of the hall, and they entered what appeared to be an old study. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with dust and forgotten things. The desk in the center of the room was cluttered with papers, some yellowed with age. At the back of the room, an old window offered a view of the garden outside, but the sky was dark and the night was closing in. They rushed to the window, and Sam pulled the curtains back, only to find the garden empty, except for the large oak tree in the distance. There was something odd about it now. The tree looked almost wrong. The shadows beneath its branches were too thick, as though something was hiding in the dark. "I don't see any way out," Sam muttered, his voice cracking. He turned away from the window and glanced around the room. "This house, it's not right. It's not just old. It feels alive." Megan's breath caught in her throat. "You're right," she said softly, but the words were barely out before a sharp, sudden noise filled the room. A loud bang, like something slamming against the walls. The floor beneath their feet seemed to shudder, and the lights flickered once more. Ben cried out, clutching his mother tightly. "Please, Mom, I want to go home." Megan swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. "Sure, it's okay, Ben. We'll figure this out. We'll get out of here." But deep down, Megan knew the truth. They might not get out. Something in this house, something old, something vengeful, was holding them here. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, even though the windows were closed. The papers on the desk fluttered, as though something unseen was moving them. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Leave now. Leave before it's too late." Sam jerked his head toward the door. "We need to go. We need to find a way out of this house. Now." They turned to leave, but as they stepped back into the hallway, the temperature in the house dropped. They could see their breath in the air, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, reaching toward them. The whispers had grown louder, almost like a chant. Then, from the corner of their eyes, they saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and its face was obscured in shadow. The figure didn't move, it just stood there watching them. Sam's heart pounded in his chest, and his voice broke as he whispered, Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. It simply took a step forward, its movement unnervingly slow and deliberate. Megan clutched Ben tighter, trying to shield him from the thing at the end of the hallway. "Sam, we need to leave. Now." But the figure didn't let them. It stepped forward again, blocking their way. The air around them grew thick and heavy, as if the house itself was pressing in on them. The whispers reached a crescendo, becoming a deafening roar, but all they could hear was one word, over and over, echoing in their minds: "Leave." Sam tried to step forward, but his legs felt like lead. It was as though the house itself was holding him back, as though the walls were pushing him away. We can't go back." Megan's eyes filled with terror. What do we do? What do we do?" Ben whimpered, "Mom, I'm scared." Just then the figure moved again, this time much faster. It rushed toward them with a speed that didn't seem possible. Sam screamed, pushing Megan and Ben behind him, but the figure was too close. It stopped in front of them, just inches away, and in that moment Megan saw its face. The eyes were hollow, dark pits, and its mouth twisted into an unnatural, terrifying grin. It was the face of someone who had been dead for years. The whispers stopped, and for the briefest of moments, everything was silent. Then, the house seemed to groan, the walls shaking as if something inside it was waking up. The figure leaned forward, its voice a rasping whisper that scraped at Megan's bones. "You are not welcome here. Leave or suffer." Before they could react, the house seemed to come alive. Doors slammed shut, windows shattered, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The family screamed as they were swallowed by the house, never to be seen again. The house waited patiently. The house stood still after the screams faded, as though it had taken a deep breath, savoring the silence. The air, once thick with terror, settled back into a cold, oppressive stillness. No more sounds of rushing footsteps or desperate cries. Only the faint echo of something, some presence, lingering in the shadows. The walls hummed faintly, vibrating with something ancient and dark. Outside, the night was unnaturally still. The wind had died, leaving behind a quiet that was almost too heavy, too perfect. There were no cars driving by, no distant chatter from the neighbors. Only the quiet hum of a world unaware of what had transpired inside that house. The oak tree in the yard, which had once seemed so ordinary, now looked even more out of place. Its twisted branches reached upward like skeletal fingers, and the shadows beneath its leaves seemed darker, thicker, more solid. No bird dared fly near it, no insect dared crawl along its gnarled roots. The tree was a silent sentinel, watching, waiting. Inside, the house had returned to its usual stillness. But this stillness wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, as if every room, every hallway was alive, pressing against the air around it. And in the deepest part of the house, the floorboards creaked faintly. A door long forgotten slowly opened. It was the door that led to the cellar, the one the family never had a chance to explore. But now, the air around it grew heavy, swirling with an unseen force. The room behind that door, dark and long untouched, seemed to beckon. The house had its secrets, and it wasn't finished with its story yet. Back in the town, just a few days later, the house remained vacant, as it always had. No one had dared move into it after the tragic disappearance of the last family, and the rumors about the house only grew with time. It was known by all who lived in the town as the cursed house. No one went near it. Its reputation was enough to keep people away, to keep the memory of what had happened sealed inside its rotting walls. But like all things forgotten, the house was soon overlooked by the bustling world around it. The roads near it, once carefully avoided, became just another part of the town's landscape. People spoke in hushed tones, but soon the whispers faded, swallowed up by the noise of life. Until one rainy evening, when a new family moved into town. They were unaware of the history that clung to the house, of the darkness it held. They were simply looking for a place to start fresh, to escape the city and find peace in the quiet of the countryside. The house, with its imposing silhouette and tall, dark windows, seemed perfect for them, a new beginning. But that night, as the family settled in, the house woke up again. The whispers came first, soft, like a faint breeze brushing against the windows, but they were there, just beneath the sound of the rain tapping gently against the panes. At first, the new family thought nothing of it. They were used to the sounds of an old house, creaking floors, groaning beams, drafts through the cracks. But soon, the sounds grew louder, and the house seemed to move, to breathe. The father, a man named Daniel, sat up late one night, reading in the living room. The storm outside raged, the wind howling through the trees. He heard the sound then, the faint scrape of something dragging along the floor. He glanced toward the hallway, his eyes narrowing. Nothing, but it didn't stop there. The noise grew louder, coming closer, as if something was inching closer to him. "Who's there?" Daniel called out, his voice wavering. The shadows in the room flickered strangely, as if the darkness itself was shifting. The house seemed to watch him, to study him. And then, from the depths of the hallway came the whisper, low, guttural, and unmistakable. "Leave." Daniel stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. His heart hammered in his chest as he slowly stood up, his body betraying him with every step as he moved toward the hallway. The house was silent once more. Only the wind outside broke the stillness. When he reached the hall, everything was dark. There were no signs of movement, no shadows shifting in the corners. It was as if nothing had happened at all. But Daniel's mind raced. He had heard it. He couldn't deny it. He turned to the stairs, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the second floor. With slow, cautious steps, he climbed the stairs, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The house seemed to breathe with him, its walls groaning under the pressure of each movement. He reached the top of the stairs and stopped dead in his tracks. At the end of the hallway, a door stood ajar. He had never seen it before. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. His heart thudded louder in his chest as he slowly walked toward the door. He could feel the air around him grow colder, heavier. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and every instinct screamed at him to turn back. But he couldn't. Something compelled him forward. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. And there, in the dim light, stood a figure, a tall, thin figure with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, its face pale and gaunt. Its clothes were torn, as if they had been weathered by time and decay. And in its hands, it held something familiar. The ring, the one that belonged to the family that had lived here before. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered, its voice rasping, as if it had been lost for years. "This house is ours, and now you belong to it." Daniel stumbled back, his heart racing in terror. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. And outside, the oak tree shifted. Its branches stretched further into the sky, and its shadow grew, spreading across the yard. The house had claimed another. The whispers, once faint, now filled the night. They were everywhere, calling out to those who dared to listen. The night stretched on, thick and suffocating, as the wind howled through the trees. Inside the house, the air grew colder with every passing second. The shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to move and shift, bending in unnatural ways. Daniel's heart still pounded in his chest as he stumbled back from the doorway, eyes wide with terror. He could still see the hollow eyes of the figure staring at him, burning into his mind. "What do you want from me?" Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. He glanced around, but the hallway was empty now. The door was shut tight, as if nothing had happened at all. But the house knew better. It knew what it had done. Daniel's breath quickened as his eyes darted around the room. There were no more whispers, no footsteps. The stillness was so thick it felt like the walls themselves were pressing in on him. He felt trapped. Suddenly, a creaking sound echoed from below, the distinct sound of footsteps on the stairs. Then another creak, closer this time. It wasn't his imagination. Someone or something was coming up the stairs. He backed away from the door, his legs trembling. His eyes scanned the hallway for any signs of movement, but all he saw was the flicker of moonlight slipping through the cracked window, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. The silence felt unbearable. The footsteps grew louder, closer. "Who's there?" Daniel called, his voice hoarse and uncertain. No answer came. His fingers brushed the wall as he reached for the light switch. But just as his hand was about to make contact, the lights flickered and died, plunging the house into complete darkness. Daniel's breath hitched, and the cold, damp air wrapped around him like an iron vice. And then, from the darkness, a voice. Low, hollow, echoing. "You don't belong here." The whisper came from everywhere at once. From the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. Daniel's eyes shot to the stairs. The figure, still pale and gaunt, was standing at the bottom, its face half hidden in the shadows. It didn't move, but its eyes locked onto him, unmoving and endless, as though they could see straight into his soul. The silence between them was thick enough to suffocate him. For a moment, Daniel couldn't move. His feet felt glued to the floor, his body refusing to obey. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. His thoughts were muddled, too consumed with the image of that thing, staring at him, just waiting. "You came here," the figure rasped. Its voice was like dry leaves scraping against stone. "But you didn't ask. You didn't ask if you were welcome." A low, guttural laugh escaped the figure's lips, but it sounded wrong, distorted, like it came from the depths of a broken throat. "We didn't leave," the voice continued. "We're still here. We'll always be here." The floor creaked beneath Daniel's feet as the figure slowly moved closer. Each step it took was deliberate, heavy with an unnatural weight that seemed to crush the air around it. Daniel forced himself to move, his legs trembling beneath him as he backed away down the hallway. He glanced over his shoulder. The hallway stretched out in front of him, long and dark, an endless tunnel of suffocating shadows. The walls seemed to close in around him as he stumbled toward the staircase. But just as his hand reached out for the railing, he froze. The air in the room grew colder, heavier, and his breath clouded in front of him like smoke. The walls, once still, now shuddered and groaned, as if the house was alive and breathing with him. The sound of whispering returned, louder this time. It came from all directions, swirling around him, growing more frenzied, more desperate. Suddenly, the lights flickered once more, and then a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. A woman, her face pale, her eyes empty. Her mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile, far too wide for any human. Her long, tangled hair fell around her face like a curtain of shadows, and her hands were clawed, reaching for him. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He backed up further, his breath shallow as he tried to speak. "Who are you?" he gasped, his throat tight with fear. But the woman didn't answer. She only smiled that horrible smile and began to move toward him. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if she enjoyed the terror in his eyes. The closer she came, the colder the air grew, until Daniel's skin felt frozen. "Please," Daniel whispered, the words barely leaving his mouth. The woman's smile widened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. And then, with a sickening, almost imperceptible lurch, the house seemed to shift. The walls buckled inward, the windows rattled, and the air seemed to thicken with something dark, ancient. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the house itself were feeding off his fear. The woman's hands shot out toward him. "Leave!" Daniel screamed, but it was too late. She lunged at him, her fingers wrapping around his arm with a strength that should have been impossible for someone so frail. He screamed, trying to pull away, but her grip tightened, her nails digging into his skin. "No," she hissed, her voice low and sweet. "You don't leave." The shadows in the room seemed to twist and bend around them, darkening until it felt as though the entire house was closing in on him, suffocating him in a prison of shadows. The woman's grip tightened around his arm, and as he struggled to break free, he heard it, the sound of something shifting in the walls, behind the walls. Something alive. "You should have asked," the woman whispered. "Now you're ours." The walls groaned once more, and the house, no longer a home, let out a terrible, hungry sound, as though it were ready to consume him whole. The door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. The whispers echoed through every corner as the house began to breathe once again. And outside, the oak tree's twisted branches reached toward the sky, waiting for the next family. Let's start with the next story. It was well past midnight when the phone rang, piercing the stillness of the quiet apartment. Lydia had been trying to sleep after a long, exhausting day. Her head ached, her body ached, and all she wanted was a few hours of rest before facing another busy morning at work. But the shrill noise of the phone cut through the silence, jarring her awake. She groggily reached for the phone, glancing at the screen. The name on the display made her stomach twist. It was Emily. But how? Lydia had been at Emily's funeral just last week. It felt like a cruel joke, the universe playing some kind of twisted prank. Emily was gone. The car accident had been too sudden, too violent. Lydia still couldn't shake the image of her best friend lying in the coffin, pale and still. She hesitated, staring at the phone in her hand, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone else was calling from Emily's phone. But the screen stayed lit up, the name unchanged. Emily. Lydia took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she accepted the call. She brought the phone to her ear. "Emily?" Lydia's voice was shaky, thick with disbelief. On the other end, she heard a quiet sob. "Lydia," came the weak voice, barely above a whisper. It was unmistakable. It was Emily's voice. Lydia's heart skipped a beat. "Emily?" Lydia whispered, the air thick in her lungs. Her chest tightened with fear. You're..." This isn't possible. You're... I'm scared, Lydia, Emily interrupted, her voice frantic now. Please, please, you have to help me. I don't know where I am. It's dark. It's so dark, and I can't get out. Lydia's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Emily had died. She had stood at the gravesite, feeling the damp earth settle over her best friend's body. It had all been too real, too painful. Emily, how are you? Lydia began, but the line went dead. Lydia froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and her hands shook. She stared at the phone in her palm. There was no signal, no reason for the call to have gone through. But it had, and the voice on the other end, it had been Emily's. Her heart was pounding now, each beat echoing in her ears. She tried to call back, but it went straight to voicemail. Nothing. The call had ended as quickly as it had started. Lydia sat there, gripping the phone in her hands, staring at the screen. The silence felt heavier now, as though the weight of the moment had settled around her. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. Something wasn't right. The phone had definitely been connected to Emily's number. She remembered it so clearly. Emily had always been the one to call in the middle of the night, sharing secrets, comforting Lydia during her darkest moments. But now Emily was gone. Lydia's head spun, a wave of dizziness overwhelming her. She tried to shake it off, trying to convince herself it was all a mistake. Maybe it was a wrong number. Maybe someone had hacked Emily's phone, using it for some cruel joke. But there was no explanation that felt right. Lydia stood up, her legs unsteady, and paced the room. She reached for her coat, then stopped. What was she even thinking? If Emily's voice was on that call, then Emily wasn't really gone. The thought felt impossible, like a punch to her gut, but the fear in her chest wouldn't let her dismiss it. She stumbled towards the door, her thoughts racing. She had to go to the house. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe someone else had been in contact with Emily before the accident. Maybe she just needed to see her, to make sense of the madness in her head. The wind was sharp when Lydia stepped outside, the cool air biting at her skin. The sky was dark, the only light coming from the distant streetlights, casting long, eerie shadows across the empty streets. Her breath formed clouds in the air as she walked, the sound of her footsteps echoing around her. It wasn't far to Emily's house. She could walk there in 10 minutes, but with every step, the feeling that something wasn't right seemed to grow stronger. There was an unease in the air that Lydia couldn't shake. Her mind kept racing, piecing together fragments of the conversation, of the call, of Emily's voice. What if she was in trouble? What if she needed her? By the time Lydia reached Emily's house, her stomach was in knots. The house was dark, the blinds drawn shut. The driveway was empty, the grass in front overgrown. Emily had always taken pride in keeping the lawn neat, the garden well kept. The house was supposed to be a home, a place where her family was safe and warm. But now the house felt abandoned. The air around it was thick with an oppressive feeling, as if something was waiting, something watching. Lydia stood in front of the house, unsure of what to do next. She reached for the doorbell, hesitating before she pressed it. The sound echoed inside, too loud, too sudden in the still night. No answer. She tried the doorknob. It turned easily, the door creaking open. The familiar smell of Emily's house, the faint scent of vanilla and cinnamon, filled the air. It was so normal, so like her friend. But something was wrong. Lydia stepped inside, calling out softly, "Emily?" Nothing. The house felt empty, colder than it should have been. The air seemed thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then from the hallway a sound, a soft scraping noise. Lydia's heart raced. She turned slowly, the darkness seeming to swallow the edges of the room. The hallway stretched before her, and at the end of it, she could just make out a shadow, a figure. Her breath hitched in her throat. It couldn't be. It couldn't be Emily. But there it was. Lydia's voice trembled. "Emily? Is that you?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, staring back at her. The silence was deafening. Lydia's mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening, what she was seeing. The figure shifted slightly, stepping closer. And as it did, the lights flickered, casting long, strange shadows across the walls. The figure came into clearer view. Lydia's blood ran cold. It wasn't Emily. It was something else, something wrong. Lydia stood frozen in place, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it could be heard across the entire street. The figure at the end of the hallway was still, yet it felt as though it was somehow moving closer, though its feet never lifted from the floor. The shadowy form was tall, gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. The air around it felt cold, frigid, as though the very temperature of the house was being pulled toward it. Lydia swallowed, her throat dry. She tried to speak, but found her voice trapped somewhere deep inside her. The figure didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge her presence. It simply continued to move toward her, its movements jerky, unsettling. Every step it took seemed to echo in the silence of the house. And then it stopped. Just a few feet from Lydia, the shadow came to a halt. It tilted its head, as if studying her, its dark, hollow eyes locked onto hers. Her breath caught in her chest. There was no mistaking it now. The thing before her wasn't human, it couldn't be. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, they were wide, unblinking, like black holes that seemed to suck in all light. Lydia couldn't move, couldn't look away. Fear gripped her heart, freezing her in place. But then a voice, soft and ragged, whispered from somewhere deep within the thing's chest. "Help me, Lydia." Her blood ran cold. It was Emily's voice. The sound of it sent a shock through Lydia, her body stiffening, her mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be Emily, could it? No, it couldn't be. Emily was gone, buried just days ago. But this thing, whatever it was, had spoken her name. It had spoken in the same way Emily used to. Lydia took a shaky step back, her legs like jelly beneath her. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she had to get out of there. She turned, stumbling toward the front door. But as she moved, the shadow shifted again, its limbs twisting in an unnatural way. It made no sound, but Lydia felt its presence move behind her, following her every step. Panic rose in her chest, suffocating her. "Lydia, don't leave me." The voice, impossibly close now, sent a jolt of terror through her body. It was Emily's voice, but distorted, as if coming from deep within a well. Lydia's fingers fumbled at the doorknob, her hands slick with sweat. She yanked at it, but the door wouldn't budge. The lock. It was stuck. "Help me," the voice pleaded again, and Lydia felt a cold breath at the back of her neck. She turned sharply, but there was nothing behind her, nothing but darkness. Her heart was in her throat now. She wasn't sure what she was running from, or who, but she knew one thing. She had to get out. She had to escape. She reached for her phone, her hands shaking, trying to call for help. But as the screen lit up, she saw it. The call had come through again. "Emily?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The call ended before she could even hear the answer. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. The house seemed to close in on her, the walls stretching outward, the air growing thick and heavy. The temperature had dropped drastically, and a suffocating pressure weighed on her chest. She tried again to open the door, but it wouldn't move. Her mind was racing. What had happened? Why was Emily calling her from beyond the grave? And then, from somewhere deep within the house, a low, mournful sound echoed through the halls. It was a faint whisper at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. "Lydia!" It was Emily's voice again. But this time, it wasn't pleading. It wasn't begging for help. It was a command, a demand. "Come find me." Lydia's blood ran cold. Her breath hitched. The voice seemed to be coming from every direction, reverberating off the walls, filling the room with a sense of impending doom. She could hear it, feel it in her bones. "Come find me, Lydia." Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run, to get out, to escape this nightmare. but her feet didn't move. She was rooted to the spot, as though some invisible force, was keeping her there, holding her in place. Her heart was beating too fast, her chest too tight. It wasn't just the house that felt wrong anymore. It was her mind. Her thoughts were starting to slip. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But every part of her screamed that it was. Her best friend, dead, buried, gone. Yet here, in the darkness of Emily's house, Lydia was being haunted by her voice. "Come find me, Lydia." The voice came again, this time with a sharpness that cut through the silence like a knife. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a demand, a command. Lydia felt herself moving forward, drawn toward the source of the voice. She wasn't sure why. She wasn't sure how. It was as though she had no choice in the matter. She found herself walking down the hallway, her feet moving of their own accord, dragging her toward the darkness at the end. The house seemed to stretch, the walls closing in around her, but she couldn't stop herself. Step by step, she made her way toward the source of the voice. And as she did, the temperature dropped further, the air thick with an unexplainable chill. She reached the end of the hall, her hand trembling as it reached for the door. Behind it, something waited. Lydia's fingers trembled as they gripped the cold, brass doorknob. She hesitated, the pressure building in her chest. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to open the door. The voice, Emily's voice, was still echoing in her ears, urging her forward, drawing her into the darkness beyond the door. "Come find me, Lydia." The words vibrated in her skull, and before she could stop herself, she turned the knob. The door creaked open, its hinges groaning as though protesting the intrusion. Beyond the door was a room she hadn't seen before, a room that didn't belong in this house. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, stained with what looked like old, dried blood. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on her shoulders. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the moon that filtered through a single cracked window. At the center of the room, standing in the middle of a broken floorboard, was a mirror. It was old, its frame ornate, carved with strange symbols that Lydia didn't recognize. The glass was cracked in several places, the shards glinting like teeth in the dim light. But what caught her attention was the reflection. There, standing in the mirror, was Emily. Lydia's breath hitched in her throat, her heart skipping a beat. The figure in the mirror was exactly like Emily, her best friend, the woman she had buried only days ago. But something was wrong. The Emily in the reflection didn't look the same. Her face was pale, drawn, her eyes dark and hollow, as if something had drained the life from her. She was smiling, but it wasn't the warm, comforting smile Lydia had known all her life. This was a cold, twisted grin that sent a chill down Lydia's spine. "Lydia," Emily's reflection said, her voice now cold and distant, "you came." Lydia took a step back, her heart racing. She knew this wasn't right. She knew this couldn't be real. But there she was, staring back at her from the broken mirror, as real as the night itself. Emily?" Lydia whispered, her voice shaking. She wanted to believe it was her, wanted to believe this was just some terrible nightmare. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The reflection of Emily stepped closer to the mirror, her movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes never left Lydia's, and with each step she took, the room seemed to grow colder, the darkness more suffocating. "I'm not the same," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper now. "I'm not who you think I am anymore." Lydia's chest tightened. She didn't understand what was happening. She couldn't. But she felt it in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't her friend. This wasn't Emily. "Why?" Lydia choked out, tears welling up in her eyes. "What happened to you?" The reflection of Emily tilted her head, her smile widening. "You left me," she said softly. "You left me behind. Now, you have to come with me." Lydia's breath caught in her throat, and the room seemed to grow darker, the walls pressing in around her. Her legs shook, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she could move. But the voice, Emily's voice, called to her again. "Come find me, Lydia." It wasn't just the voice now. It was something more, something deeper. Lydia could feel it in the marrow of her bones. This wasn't a call for help. This was a call to join her, to cross into the other side. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But her feet were rooted to the floor, her body trembling with fear. The reflection of Emily reached out, her hand pressing against the cracked surface of the mirror, and for a moment, Lydia thought she could feel the cold, clammy touch against her own skin. "Lydia," Emily whispered once more, her voice now cold and detached. "It's too late. You're already mine." The mirror cracked louder, the sound sharp and jarring, and before Lydia could react, the reflection of Emily reached through the glass. The room seemed to distort, bending and warping as if the very air around her was alive, fighting against her. Lydia stumbled backward, her mind scrambling to make sense of what she was seeing. The mirror, now shattered, was empty. There was nothing but a thick, inky darkness beyond it, and then she heard the footsteps. They weren't the soft, slow steps of the thing in the hallway. No, these were the quick, sharp sounds of someone running, approaching her at a terrifying speed. Lydia turned, her heart thundering in her chest, but all she saw was the shadowy figure darting toward her. The cold breath on the back of her neck, the hands reaching out for her. She spun around, her eyes wide with panic, and saw nothing but darkness. No one was there, but she could feel the presence, closing in on her, surrounding her. "Lydia," the voice again. This time, it was not just Emily's. It was a chorus of voices, all distorted, all twisted, calling to her, beckoning her closer. Lydia screamed, her breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to leave. She had to escape. But the door she had entered through, was gone. It wasn't just gone. It had never been there. She was trapped. "Lydia, you can't leave," the voice called again, now a collective roar. "You're ours." Lydia's pulse raced as she backed up into the cold, damp wall. Her breath came in desperate gasps. The walls were closing in. The darkness around her was suffocating. And then, with a final, deafening crash, the shadows overtook her. Sarah sat frozen, her phone still pressed against her ear, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. The sound of her friend's frantic crying echoed in her mind, each sob more desperate than the last. She blinked rapidly, trying to shake the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over her like a thick fog. "I'm hearing things. I'm just tired," she whispered to herself, pacing back and forth across the living room. "It's just a dream, or maybe I've been working too hard." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. Her thoughts immediately went to the funeral. Just last week, she had watched her best friend, Emily, being lowered into the ground. The grief, the heartbreak, it had been too much to bear. How could anyone expect her to recover from that so soon? She was still haunted by the image of Emily's pale face, the stillness of her body in the casket, the finality of it all. But this call, it wasn't a dream. The phone vibrated again in her hand, and Sarah hesitated for a moment. She didn't want to look at the screen. Part of her was terrified to see who was calling, but another part, the logical, reasonable part, wanted to confirm it was just a wrong number, or a glitch, or something else that made sense. Slowly, she glanced at the caller ID. The number was unfamiliar, a strange string of digits that sent another shiver down her spine. "No," she whispered under her breath. "This is insane." She didn't know how to react, whether to answer or to hang up, to scream or cry. Everything seemed wrong. The phone call, the memory of Emily, the unshakable feeling that something was terribly amiss. Her hand trembled as she pressed the green button, bringing the phone back to her ear. She could feel her heartbeat quickening. "Hello," she said, her voice barely audible. There was a pause, a long, uncomfortable silence. Then, the unmistakable sound of Emily's voice, soft, strained, and breaking. "Sarah, help me." Sarah's breath hitched. She recognized the voice immediately. She had heard it so many times before, in conversations, in laughter, in moments of comfort. But now it was different. The words were distorted, like they were being pulled from some faraway place, dragged through static and broken air. "Sarah, please, they won't let me go." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the chest. Her mind spun as she tried to process them. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The confusion, the disbelief, everything tangled in her mind, suffocating her ability to think clearly. Emily had been buried. She had been gone. But the voice on the other end of the line was real. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a trick of her mind. It was Emily. "Sarah," the voice whispered, closer now, almost as if it was right next to her. "Help me, before they take me forever." The line went dead. The call ended, leaving nothing but the cold, empty silence in its wake. Sarah stood there, trembling, staring at her phone as if it might explode in her hands. Her thoughts were racing, tumbling over one another. She felt like she was suffocating in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. And then suddenly there was a knock at the door. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat as the knock echoed through the silence of the house. It was slow, deliberate, 3 firm raps, followed by an eerie pause. She froze, staring at the door, her breath caught in her chest. Who could it be? It was past midnight. No one ever came by at this hour, especially not after what had just happened. Was it possible that the voice on the phone was real? Could it have been someone else, someone playing a sick prank? But no, she had heard Emily's voice, that unmistakable sobbing desperation. With trembling hands, she reached for the door handle. Her skin prickled, every nerve on edge, and yet she had to see who was standing outside. She had to know what was going on. Slowly, she turned the handle, the soft click echoing in the air. The door creaked open, revealing the empty porch outside. Nothing but the dim glow of the streetlight and the quiet whisper of the wind. No one was there. A wave of confusion washed over her, mingled with a deep sense of unease. Her fingers brushed the doorframe, her breath still shaky as she leaned out, scanning the dark yard. There was no sign of anyone. No footsteps in the dirt, no movement in the shadows. Just the same empty space. She closed the door slowly, her mind reeling. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. What the hell is going on? She thought, gripping the phone in her hand. She glanced at the screen again, hoping for some clue, some message that could explain everything. But the screen was blank, nothing but the lock screen staring back at her. Then, as if in response to her growing sense of dread, the phone vibrated again. This time, there was no hesitation. She immediately swiped the screen to answer, praying it wasn't more of the same. "Hello," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence on the other end was thick and suffocating. It seemed to stretch on for far too long. And then, just when Sarah was about to hang up, she heard it. The same voice from before, only this time it was softer, almost calm, but still filled with an underlying terror. "Sarah, don't open the door." Her stomach churned. The voice was Emily's, her best friend's voice, no question about it. But it was wrong. It sounded distant, like it was coming from a faraway place, as if Emily were speaking from beyond the grave. Sarah's legs trembled beneath her, but she forced herself to stay standing, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "Emily," she whispered, "is that really you?" The voice responded, but this time it was clearer, filled with a sense of urgency. "I'm not where you think I am," Emily said, her words punctuated by what sounded like frantic breathing. They're keeping me here. They won't let me go. I need you to listen to me. Don't open the door. Whatever you do, don't open the door." Sarah's mind was spinning. Every part of her screamed to ask more, to demand answers. What did she mean by they? Where was she? How was this even happening? Emily was dead. She had seen it with her own eyes. She had been there when they buried her. But the voice on the phone was real. It was Emily, sounding as desperate and terrified as she had been in life. The room felt colder now. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. Her thoughts were a whirlpool of confusion and fear. But the voice on the phone, Emily's voice, kept repeating the same warning. "Don't open the door, Sarah," Emily pleaded, her voice breaking again. "Please, they'll take you too." Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears as her eyes darted toward the door. She had to know. She had to understand what was happening. She could feel the weight of Emily's words, but something deep inside her resisted. What if this was some sort of sick joke? What if there was someone playing with her head, manipulating her emotions, trying to make her lose her grip on reality? Yet, despite all the rational thoughts swimming through her mind, a part of Sarah knew she couldn't ignore the fear that gripped her chest. The way the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker with each passing second. Something wasn't right. Something had been wrong from the very beginning. The phone call ended abruptly once again, the silence so sudden and final that Sarah felt her heart stop for a moment. She stood there, staring at the door, her breath shallow, her hands still clutching the phone. The house felt different now, darker, as if the shadows were creeping closer. The warmth of her living room seemed to drain away, leaving only cold, empty air. Then, there was another knock at the door. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. Her breath hitched as the knock echoed through the silence of the house once more. It was slow, deliberate, just like before, 3 raps, followed by that eerie, unsettling pause. The coldness in the room seemed to intensify, creeping into her bones. Her thoughts raced, but her body remained frozen in place. It couldn't be her. It couldn't be Emily. But the warning, that voice, was it a trick? Had someone somehow found a way to manipulate her into thinking this was happening? But how? How could they have known the conversation she had just had with Emily? No, this wasn't a trick. Deep down, she knew it wasn't. A sense of dread washed over her, stronger than anything she'd ever felt. She had no choice now. She had to know who was on the other side of that door. She had to confront whoever was out there. With trembling hands, she stepped forward, her feet dragging as if the floor itself was holding her back. She reached for the handle again, her fingers slick with sweat. Each second felt like an eternity. The air was thick with fear, her pulse deafening in her ears. She opened the door slowly, inch by inch, her heart pounding harder with each movement. And then, just as before, the door creaked open fully. The porch was empty. There was no one there. Not a soul. No footsteps, no figure in the shadows. The world outside seemed still, eerily quiet, as if time had paused, holding its breath. Sarah's heart sank. Was she losing her mind? Was she imagining everything? The knocking, the voice on the phone. Was it all just a nightmare? She leaned against the doorframe, her head spinning, trying to ground herself. But the silence outside mocked her. Then she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from behind her, at the edge of the living room, where the hallway began to stretch into the dark shadows of the house. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it grew louder with each passing second. "Sarah!" That voice. It was unmistakable. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing at the edge of the hallway, bathed in the dim light from the living room, was Emily. But it wasn't the Emily she had known. No, this was different. This version of Emily was pale, her skin waxen, almost translucent. Her eyes, those familiar brown eyes, were wide, empty, and full of something Sarah couldn't quite place. Her lips were slightly parted, but no sound came from them. The air in the room thickened, a heavy weight pressing down on Sarah's chest, making it harder to breathe. She felt cold, freezing cold. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet, and the shadows stretched unnaturally, as if they were creeping toward Emily, drawn to her presence. "Sarah," Emily whispered again, her voice ragged, barely audible. "You have to listen to me. They'll take you too. You have to run. You have to get out of here before they find you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her legs shaking as she took a step backward. "Emily?" she whispered, her voice trembling. What's happening? What's going on? Emily didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, her eyes unblinking, staring at Sarah with that same hollow look. The silence in the room grew unbearable, like the world had ceased to exist outside of that moment. Then suddenly Emily stepped forward. Sarah gasped, stumbling back, but Emily moved with an unnatural grace, her feet barely touching the ground. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she were being pulled towards Sarah by some unseen force. Each step echoed in Sarah's ears, sharp and cold, sending chills down her spine. "Sarah, you don't understand," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "They've been waiting for you. They won't let you go. They'll keep you here, forever." Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. "No, I won't let them. I won't let you." Before she could finish, the temperature in the room dropped again, this time with a violent force. The walls seemed to pulse like they were breathing, the floor beneath her feet groaning, as if the house itself was alive. Suddenly, Emily's body jerked violently, as though something had taken hold of her, something that wasn't her. Her face contorted, her mouth opening wide in a silent scream that echoed throughout the house, but no sound came out. It was as if she were caught between two worlds, fighting to stay grounded in one and torn away by something far more sinister. "Sarah," Emily's voice came again, but this time it was not her own. It was deeper, raspier, something dark, something ancient. "Run. It's too late. They've already claimed you." The air around Sarah crackled with an unholy energy, and the shadows in the room thickened, swirling around Emily as though they were part of her. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the depths of the house, vibrating through the floorboards, through Sarah's very bones. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, everything stopped. Silence. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, staring at the empty hallway. Emily was gone. The coldness had lifted. The shadows no longer moved. Everything seemed normal again, but Sarah knew better. The phone in her hand buzzed once more. Sarah stood still, her body trembling as she glanced at the phone in her hand. Her fingers clutched the device as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. She knew deep down that whatever was happening wasn't over. It couldn't be. The house, the strange voice, the coldness, it all felt wrong, like a nightmare that refused to release its grip. The phone buzzed again. Slowly, she raised it to her ear. Her mind screamed for her not to answer, to ignore it, to run, but her hand betrayed her. She pressed the answer button, her breath shallow, as if the very act of lifting the phone could summon whatever was waiting for her on the other end. The line crackled, as though the call itself were being distorted. A low, static hum filled her ear, but underneath it, there was something else. A voice, soft at first, but unmistakably familiar. "Sarah," her breath hitched. It was Emily's voice, again, but there was something different about it. Cold, distant, not the same voice she had heard just moments ago in the hallway. "Emily?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely a sound. "Sarah, they're here." Emily's voice came through the static, a mix of fear and desperation. "They won't let you go. They're already inside. They've been waiting for you." Sarah felt her stomach twist, her pulse racing. She knew somehow that the words weren't just a warning. They were a threat. She didn't know who, or what, was on the other end of the line, but it wasn't Emily. Not truly. "Emily, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking as the darkness in the room seemed to grow heavier around her. There was a pause, a breathless silence before Emily spoke again. Her voice was thin, strained, as if she were speaking from far away, through a tunnel. "It's not me anymore, Sarah," Emily whispered. "They've taken me." A loud crash echoed in the distance, making Sarah flinch. It came from the upstairs, a sharp, violent sound that rattled the walls. Sarah froze, her eyes darting to the ceiling, where shadows seemed to move unnaturally. There was a flicker in the corner of her vision, something shifting in the darkness, like the house itself was watching her. "Don't listen to it," Emily's voice came again, more urgent this time, but still distant. "It's not me." Sarah swallowed hard, her hand trembling against the phone. She didn't know what to do. Her thoughts scrambled, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. But one thing was clear: the house was not just haunted by memories. It was haunted by something much darker. I'm coming for you, Emily," Sarah whispered, but the words tasted hollow in her mouth. She didn't know what she was coming for, or how she could possibly help. Suddenly, the phone line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the sound of her own breathing became unbearably loud in the empty room. She glanced at the phone again, its screen dark and lifeless. Her grip on it was loose, as though she no longer cared about anything so mundane. The world around her seemed to blur, as if the very air was thickening, wrapping her in a suffocating embrace. A soft rustle, like footsteps from above, made her freeze. There was no mistaking it. Someone or something was walking upstairs, slowly, deliberately, each step echoing in the silence of the house. Sarah's blood ran cold. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The house, it was alive. It was watching her, pulling her deeper into its web of madness. She glanced toward the hallway, her eyes widening as she saw it, the shadow. It was standing at the end of the hall, just beyond the edge of the living room. A figure, dark and formless, its outline barely visible against the shadows. It stood perfectly still, but Sarah could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on her chest. The temperature dropped again, the air growing impossibly cold, as if the very essence of life was being sucked out of the room. The footsteps above her stopped. "Sarah," the voice whispered from behind her. It was Emily's voice, but it was no longer familiar. It was raw, hollow, full of anguish. Don't open it. Don't go." The voice faded, replaced by an unnatural groaning from the house, as if it were stretching and twisting, the wooden walls creaking under a heavy weight. The shadow moved then, slowly, creeping toward her. Sarah backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know what to do. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls narrowing with every breath, every beat of her heart. Her hands were clammy, her body drenched in sweat despite the cold. The shadow continued to advance, its form growing clearer, more defined with every step it took toward her. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. "Sarah!" The voice came again, closer now, right behind her, breathing down her neck. "You can't leave." The room seemed to spin as Sarah's mind scrambled for an escape, for something, anything, that could free her from this nightmare. She reached for the door, but her fingers brushed against the doorknob, and suddenly it was gone. The door was no longer where it should have been. The hallway had twisted, bent, reshaped itself, and the door to the outside world was now far away, unreachable. A low, guttural laugh filled the room, its sound like nails on a chalkboard, scratching across Sarah's mind, driving her to the edge of sanity. She turned, desperate now, her breath ragged. Her gaze darted around the room. There was no escape, no way out. "They've been waiting for you, Sarah." The voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't Emily's. It was something else, something far darker. "And now you'll never leave." The walls began to pulse, the house seeming to breathe around her, as if it were alive, its own heart beating in rhythm with hers. Sarah's pulse was racing, her breath shallow, her vision starting to blur. The shadow moved again, and this time it was right behind her, its cold presence pressing against her skin. She could feel the temperature drop even further, as if the warmth of her body was being stolen by the very air around her. "No!" Sarah whispered to herself, her voice trembling. She couldn't stay here. She had to escape, had to find a way out. But the house had already won. The shadow loomed closer, its form still shifting, growing more formless by the second. It was not human. It was something older, something that had existed long before her, long before this house. The walls creaked under its weight, groaning and moaning, and in the distance, the faint sound of someone, scratching against the floorboards echoed in the dark. "Sarah!" The voice that had once been Emily's echoed again, but this time, it wasn't her at all. It was deeper, rougher, guttural. "Why don't you join us, Sarah?" The words slid into her ears like poison, their meaning so sinister it felt like the world itself was turning against her. She could hear the faint sound of children laughing in the distance, but it was a laugh that sent chills crawling across her skin. It wasn't innocent, it wasn't playful. It was a mocking laugh, a laugh full of malice. Sarah took a step back, stumbling as the ground beneath her seemed to shift, as though the house itself was moving. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, the scent of something long forgotten, left to rot. It was suffocating, and every breath she took felt like it might be her last. She turned toward the window, praying for a glimpse of the outside world, but there was nothing. The house was closing in on her, and no matter how much she searched, there was no escape. "You can't hide from us, Sarah," the voice whispered again, now coming from all around her. "You belong to us now." She turned quickly, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the floor felt like it was drawing closer. The very house was alive, its darkness consuming everything it touched. The walls were tightening in on her, and every inch of the room seemed to be filled with eyes. Thousands of eyes, unseen but felt, watching, waiting. Her breathing grew more erratic, her chest tightening with panic. She had to do something, anything, but her body wouldn't obey. Her legs felt like lead, too heavy to move. Her mind was filled with the image of Emily, her best friend, the one she had loved and cared for, now twisted, trapped in this place, trying to warn her. But it was too late. The floor beneath Sarah's feet groaned, and then, with a sharp crack, something shifted. The wall to her left, one she had never noticed before, began to peel away, revealing a small, narrow door. It was hidden, as though the house itself had been keeping it a secret, waiting for her to find it. "Go ahead, Sarah." The voice coiled in her mind again, and this time, she felt the dark presence moving toward her. "The door, it's waiting for you." Without thinking, without considering the consequences, Sarah ran toward the door. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her legs shaking beneath her, but something, perhaps sheer terror, forced her forward. The door opened with a soft creak, and Sarah stumbled into the narrow space beyond it. The air was thick, heavier than it had been in the house. It felt like stepping into another world, one that was suffocating, trapped in time. Her eyes darted around, desperate to find something, anything, that would make sense of what was happening. But there was nothing, just a long, dark corridor stretching out before her, a corridor she had never seen, never even suspected was here. The darkness seemed to close in from all sides, but Sarah forced herself to move forward. She had no choice now. She couldn't go back. She couldn't face what was in that room behind her. Whatever was waiting for her now, she had to confront it, or it would consume her. As she moved further down the corridor, she could hear the soft whispering again, the laughter, the cries, distorted and distant. The voices that had once been Emily's now seemed to be everywhere, tangled with the noise of something else, something older. "You're too late, Sarah." The voice came again, this time colder than ever. "You belong to us. Forever." Sarah stopped. She had reached the end of the corridor. There, in front of her, was another door. It was old, weathered, with peeling paint and a brass handle that gleamed faintly in the dim light. There was something about it, something almost familiar. She knew she had to open it, but at the same time, she didn't want to. But she had no choice. With trembling hands, Sarah reached out and turned the handle. The door opened. Beyond it was a room that seemed to exist outside of time. The walls were covered in old photographs, all of them yellowed and faded with age. In each one, there were people she didn't know, standing in front of this very house, their eyes vacant, empty. Their smiles, too wide, too perfect, sent an unsettling chill crawling down her spine. and in the center of the room was a single wooden chair, its backrest carved with intricate symbols, symbols that seemed to shift when she looked at them. The moment she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, but the door was gone. The walls had closed in. "Sarah," the voice called again, this time so close, so real. "You're ours." The air grew cold again, as if the room itself was freezing her in place. Sarah's breath came out in small, quick bursts as the weight of the room pressed down on her. The photographs on the walls seemed to shift, their eyes following her every move, and she could swear that their mouths twisted into grimaces as she turned away from them. The chair in the center of the room, the one she had been avoiding, now seemed to be calling to her. There was something about it, something she couldn't put her finger on, that made her feel like it was her destiny to sit in it. A force, like an invisible hand, seemed to push her toward it, her feet moving before she could even think. "No," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head, trying to resist, but it was like the room itself was pulling her toward that chair. As she moved closer, the whispering grew louder, its tone more urgent. "You belong here, Sarah. Come sit. Join us." She felt dizzy. The room began to spin, her vision narrowing until all she could see was the chair in front of her. The closer she got, the stronger the pull. Her body felt numb, like she had no control over it anymore. Her legs moved on their own, guiding her to the chair. Finally, she stood before it, staring down at the old, weathered seat. It looked harmless enough, but she knew better. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, to escape, to leave, but her hands, shaking uncontrollably, reached down and gripped the armrests. The moment her fingers touched the cold wood, a sharp, guttural cry filled the room. One that wasn't human, but something darker, something primal. The walls seemed to close in again, their oppressive presence pressing against her chest. Her heart hammered wildly in her chest as she slowly lowered herself into the chair. As soon as she sat, the room plunged into total darkness. "Sarah!" The voice was closer than ever, almost in her ear now. "You're home now." She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Panic gripped her throat, tightening, suffocating her. The darkness surrounded her, heavy and thick, as if it had substance. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the whispers started again. At first, they were faint, just a murmur at the edge of her hearing, but they grew louder, more distinct, until they filled her mind completely. "We've been waiting for you to join us. You should have never left." The words were a cacophony now, voices overlapping, screeching, whispering, and laughing in an endless, maddening loop. And amidst the noise, she thought she heard another voice, one that broke through the chaos. It was Emily's voice. "Sarah, help!" Her breath caught in her throat. Emily was here too. But how? She was gone. She was dead. Sarah had buried her just days ago. She had watched her friend's funeral, felt the weight of the earth settle over her. "Emily?" Sarah managed to whisper, but her voice felt swallowed by the darkness. "I'm sorry, Sarah." Emily's voice came through, faint and distant. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you. It's too late for apologies." The deep, mocking voice from before interrupted. "You are all part of us now. Forever." Sarah's hands gripped the armrests of the chair so tightly that her fingers went numb. She could feel the cold creeping up her arms, her legs, spreading throughout her body. The darkness around her pulsed with a life of its own, as if the very air had become thick with malice. Her mind raced. She needed to get out. She had to find a way to break free. "Wake up, Sarah," Emily's voice whispered again, now more desperate. "Wake up. You have to fight." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Emily's voice was still in her head, but it was different now. She wasn't just a whisper in the dark. She was guiding Sarah, pulling her back from the brink. She could still feel her friend's presence, as faint as it was, but it was enough to keep her from sinking into the dark. "Fight, Sarah." Sarah forced herself to focus, to push through the darkness. She couldn't give up. Not yet. "I'm here, Emily," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm trying." But the shadows around her pressed in harder, the darkness seeping into her very bones. The weight of the room was unbearable. She could feel herself slipping, her mind starting to unravel. "Sarah," Emily's voice was weaker now, more distant. "You have to hurry, before it's too late." The room seemed to close around her, its edges becoming distorted, twisting like some kind of nightmare. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and she could hear the scratching sound again, like something, or someone, was trying to break through the walls. The floor creaked underfoot, and a loud thud echoed in the room. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What was that?" she whispered, but no one answered. The whispers were still there, but they had taken on a new tone, a more urgent, more terrifying tone. The temperature dropped again, and a chill ran down her spine. Every inch of her body screamed at her to get up, to run, but her body refused to obey. "Sarah," the voice came again, this time sounding more like a growl. "Don't you want to stay with us?" Her mind was spinning, and she could feel herself falling deeper into the abyss. It was as if the darkness itself was dragging her down, trying to pull her under. She couldn't hold on much longer. "No!" Sarah gasped, summoning the last ounce of strength she had left. "I won't stay." Her body was frozen, but her mind was still hers. And for the first time since she sat down in the chair, Sarah forced herself to stand, to break free from the nightmare. She reached out, her hands trembling, and grabbed at the edge of the chair. She could feel the wood biting into her skin as she pulled herself up. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, but she fought them off, pushing against the pull of the dark force around her. With one final burst of strength, she yanked herself out of the chair and stumbled forward, her legs unsteady, her heart racing. She didn't look back. She didn't care to see what was behind her. She just needed to escape. The darkness continued to press in, but Sarah didn't stop. She ran. The cold air bit at her skin as Sarah stumbled blindly through the dark room, her hands brushing against the walls for guidance. The whispers still swirled around her, like 1,000 voices just on the edge of her hearing, taunting her, pulling her back. "You can't escape. You belong to us." Sarah's chest tightened, panic gripping her heart. She was running, but she wasn't sure where she was going. Every direction seemed the same, endless darkness, the smell of decay heavy in the air, the silence broken only by the whispers and the pounding of her own frantic heartbeat. Her legs wobbled, her strength fading with every step. She wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the only sound that escaped her was a soft gasp, lost in the emptiness. "No, no, no," she gasped, shaking her head violently, as though she could shake off the suffocating darkness. The floor beneath her feet groaned as she moved, as if the house itself was alive and responding to her every step. Her breath was ragged, each inhale shallow, but she forced herself to move forward. There had to be a way out. She couldn't let this, whatever it was, win. And then, something caught her eye in the dark. A faint, flickering light, a small glow at the far end of the room. Sarah's heart leapt, and her legs propelled her forward with new urgency. The light seemed to beckon to her, like a promise of safety, a way out. It was so close, yet it felt like it was slipping farther away as the shadows reached out, grabbing at her ankles. She reached for the light, desperate, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of what seemed to be a doorknob. The light was coming from behind the door, spilling out through the cracks. "Please," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Let this be it." With a shaky hand, Sarah turned the knob and pushed the door open. The moment she stepped through, the oppressive darkness was gone. The cold, the whispers, they were gone. But in their place was something far worse. Sarah blinked, confused. She was no longer in the house. She stood in a long, dimly lit hallway, its walls lined with photographs, each one identical to the ones in the house. They all stared at her, their eyes unblinking, their expressions frozen in eerie stillness. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, the light at the end seeming so far away, as though it had no intention of ever getting any closer. The air here was still cold, but this time it was different. It felt wrong, thick, like the very space she occupied was twisted, as though she didn't belong here. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. "What is this?" she whispered to herself, but her question was met only with silence. The hallway was empty, no voices, no footsteps, just the faint echo of her own. She moved cautiously, her feet hesitant as they touched the cold floor, each step feeling as though it might echo too loudly. She couldn't explain why, but the longer she stood there, the more the photographs seemed to change. Their faces, those familiar faces, began to shift, their eyes growing darker, their smiles stretching into twisted, grotesque forms. "Help me!" Emily's voice came again, so faint, so distant, but it was enough to freeze her in place. "Emily?" Sarah breathed, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned toward the source of the voice, searching the shadows for some sign of her friend. But the hallway was silent again. "Emily?" she whispered, taking a step forward. "Where are you?" The light ahead flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows against the walls. And then, just when Sarah thought she couldn't stand it any longer, the silence broke. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper reached her ears, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, dragging, slow. She spun around, her eyes wide with fear. But the hallway remained empty, the sound of the footsteps now louder, clearer, closer. Sarah took another step back, her breath shaky, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She could feel something, or someone moving behind her, following her every movement. "I can feel you watching me," she said aloud, though her voice trembled. The footsteps grew louder, faster, the sound growing closer with each passing second. "Emily?" Sarah's voice cracked. "Is that you?" But as she turned, she saw nothing. No one. She was alone. Or was she? "Sarah," a voice said from behind her, too close this time, like someone had whispered it directly into her ear. Sarah spun around again, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing before her, not more than a few feet away, was Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes wide but hollow, empty. The skin on her arms was mottled, as though decaying, and her hair hung limp around her face. The woman standing in front of Sarah wasn't her friend anymore. The thing that resembled Emily was pale, with dark circles under its eyes, and a faint, sickly grin stretched across her face. "Emily?" Sarah's voice quivered as she backed away. "It's me," the figure said softly, its voice cold and distant. "But you can't leave." Sarah's eyes widened in horror as the figure stepped forward. The footsteps were no longer dragging. They were solid, echoing in the emptiness, filling the space between them. "Please," Sarah whispered, her hands shaking as she raised them, as if to protect herself from whatever Emily had become. "I don't want to stay." The figure didn't stop. It took another step, then another, and then Emily's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You never left, Sarah," it whispered. The world seemed to tilt, the floor shifting beneath her feet. The air grew heavy, and for the first time since all of this began, Sarah realized she wasn't just running from a nightmare. She was living in one. And the worst part, she didn't know if she could ever wake up. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as Emily's twisted figure took another slow, deliberate step toward her. The world around her seemed to distort with every movement. The walls of the hallway pulsed, as if the house itself was alive, breathing in time with her panic. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "This isn't you." The thing that looked like Emily, if it was even her anymore, didn't respond. It just continued to advance, its hollow eyes fixed on Sarah, unblinking. The smile stretched wider, almost unnatural in its grotesque perfection, and its pale, decaying skin glistened in the dim light of the hallway. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. Her legs were trembling beneath her, threatening to give way at any moment. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the very air around her was pulling her back, holding her in place. "Stay away from me," she gasped, her voice cracking as she backed into the wall, her hands bracing against it for support. But Emily, or whatever it was, wasn't stopping. It didn't even seem to care about her screams, her fear. It just kept coming, its footsteps echoing louder with each passing second. "Please," Sarah begged, her voice shaking as she struggled to breathe. "Please stop." It was so close now that she could smell the sickly, rotting scent emanating from it. She could hear the soft rasp of its breathing, slow and uneven. It was almost like the thing was savoring the terror in her eyes, the way she shook as she cowered against the wall. "You're mine now, Sarah," the thing whispered, its voice distorted and hollow. "You can never leave." Her mind was racing. She couldn't understand what was happening. How was Emily here? She had buried her just days ago. She had stood in front of the casket, had felt the weight of the grief crush her chest. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. "You're not Emily," Sarah shouted, her voice desperate, almost pleading. "You're not her." The creature before her tilted its head, as if considering her words. Its grin widened, an unsettling crack that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I was Emily," it murmured, its voice low and distorted. "And now, I'm something more." Sarah couldn't move. She was frozen, her mind paralyzed with fear. The room around her was spinning, her vision narrowing. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All she could focus on was the figure before her, its every movement, its every breath, closing in on her like a nightmare she couldn't escape. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, please." But the thing wasn't listening. It was too close now, its hands outstretched toward her. Its fingers twitched, sharp and jagged, like they were reaching for something that Sarah didn't want to give. She could feel the air grow cold around her, the temperature plummeting as though the darkness was alive, hungry. Sarah's heart raced in her chest, every beat louder than the last. She could feel the weight of her fear, heavy and suffocating. She had to get away. There had to be a way out. But there was nowhere to run. The hallway stretched on, and behind her, Emily, or what was left of her, was closing in fast. "No, no, no," Sarah gasped, her voice breaking as she desperately searched for a way to escape. Her eyes darted around, but the hallway was endless. The photographs on the walls, those same haunting faces, were closing in around her too. Their eyes followed her every movement, their expressions twisting into something darker, something more sinister with every passing second. "Please, I don't belong here," Sarah cried out, her voice raw with fear. "Please let me go." The creature grinned wider, its teeth glistening in the dim light. "You were always meant to be here, Sarah," it hissed. "You've always belonged to me." Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She had to get away. She had to. The world seemed to shift. The floor beneath her feet seemed to vanish, and suddenly she was falling. Her stomach lurched as she plunged into darkness, the air rushing past her ears in a deafening roar. Then, everything stopped. The silence was deafening. Sarah's body hit the ground with a sickening thud. She gasped for air, her chest heaving, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. But the darkness wasn't complete. There was a faint glow around her, a soft, eerie light. She blinked, trying to focus, trying to make sense of where she was. The space around her was strange, like a cavern, its walls made of smooth gray stone. The air was thick with an unidentifiable scent, something sharp and bitter. She pushed herself up, her body aching from the fall, and looked around, her heart pounding in her chest. What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Before her, a figure stood, its back to her. It was a woman she didn't recognize, but there was something about her that felt familiar. Something about her presence felt like it had always been here, always watching. Emily? Sarah asked, her voice hesitant. The woman turned slowly. It wasn't Emily, but it was someone else, someone who looked like her. Who are you? Sarah asked, fear creeping into her voice. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she reached out, her hands glowing faintly in the darkness, like they were made of the very light around them. Come closer, Sarah, the woman said softly, her voice lilting, almost melodic. It's time to join us. Sarah took a hesitant step forward, her legs weak beneath her, her heart still racing. No, I don't want to. She started, but her words trailed off. She felt an overwhelming pull toward the figure, an irresistible urge to move closer. She fought it, but it was no use. Her body moved of its own accord, her feet carrying her toward the woman. It's time, Sarah, the woman whispered, her smile softening. You've always known this would happen. And as Sarah's hand reached out toward the woman's, the room began to shift again, growing darker, colder, the light of the woman's hands flickering as though it was about to vanish altogether. The whispers returned. You can't leave. You belong to us. Forever. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as the whispers grew louder, the words twisting and turning in her mind, their meaning growing clearer with every passing second. Forever. The voice echoed inside her head, reverberating through her thoughts, until she could no longer distinguish where the whispers came from. They felt like they were part of her, as if the very air around her had become infected with them. She tried to move away, tried to break free from the invisible grip that was pulling her closer to the woman. But her feet were frozen to the floor. Her limbs refused to obey, as if the darkness itself was suffocating her, trapping her in place. The woman's glowing hands reached out for her, the light flickering like a dying candle. It's time to join us, Sarah, the woman said again, her voice soft and alluring, like a lullaby meant to calm the terrified soul. No, Sarah whispered, the words slipping from her lips without her consent. I don't want this. But the more she resisted, the stronger the pull became. Her body moved against her will, taking slow, uncertain steps toward the woman. It was as if the entire cavern was alive, and the darkness itself had claimed her as its own. You are already ours. The woman's voice echoed again, and this time, it wasn't just her voice. It was the voice of the house, the voice of the grave, the voice of the thing that had taken Emily. Please, Sarah begged, her voice trembling. Please let me go. The woman smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was empty, hollow, as if there was no humanity left in her. You can't leave. The woman's words were final, cold, and final. You were never meant to. Sarah's hand, shaking with fear, reached out toward the woman's. Her skin was ice cold, her fingers trembling as they drew nearer to the woman's glowing hands. And when they finally touched, an electric shock ran through her, flooding her body with a cold that cut straight through her bones. The light intensified, and Sarah's vision blurred as if the world around her was twisting, warping. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down on her chest. She could barely breathe. It's over, Sarah. The voice was now inside her mind, a part of her own thoughts. You are one of us. Sarah closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. There was no escape, no way to fight this, no way to return to the world she had known. And then, everything went black. When Sarah opened her eyes again, she was standing in the hallway. The cold, dark hallway of her own home. The same hallway where she had seen Emily just days before. But now everything felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in on her, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. Sarah glanced around, panic flooding her chest. She couldn't remember how she had gotten here, but she knew one thing for sure. Something was terribly wrong. The house was different. The air was thick with the same oppressive silence she had felt earlier. Emily? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped forward, her eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. The silence stretched on. No answer. Nothing but the haunting stillness of the house. She felt the sudden urge to run, to escape. but her legs were heavy, her body unwilling to cooperate. The weight of the house, of whatever had happened to her, was suffocating. And then she heard it, a soft, distant ringing sound, like a phone vibrating somewhere far away. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. It was familiar. She had heard this sound before. "No," Sarah whispered, a cold chill crawling up her spine. "No, it can't be." The ringing grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost deafening. Her heart sank as she realized the truth. She had already received a call from Emily once before, a call that should never have happened. And now, as the ringing grew louder, she knew the nightmare was far from over. She staggered toward the phone, her hand shaking as she reached for it. The screen lit up with an unknown number. Her stomach churned, and her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the answer button. "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. "No more." But the phone vibrated again, harder this time, as though it were demanding her attention. With trembling hands, Sarah pressed the answer button. "Hello." Her voice cracked as she spoke, but the line remained eerily silent for a moment. Then the sound came, a faint, familiar cry, one she recognized all too well. "Help me," Emily's voice echoed from the other side of the line, faint but unmistakable. Sarah's blood ran cold. "Emily?" she gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "Emily, is that you?" The cry continued, growing louder, more desperate, as if something was trying to pull Emily away from her. Sarah could hear the strain in her voice, the same strain she had heard in that final phone call before the funeral. "Help me! Please help me!" Emily's voice came again, the words broken and jagged, as if they were being ripped apart by some unseen force. "No!" Sarah cried, her voice rising in terror. "You're dead. You're not real." The cry on the other end didn't stop. It was growing more frantic, more horrifying, as though Emily were trapped somewhere, fighting to escape. "Please, help me." The voice was weaker now, fading, almost as if it were being dragged into darkness. "I can't," Sarah sobbed, clutching the phone to her ear. "You're not here. You're gone." And then the line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. But Sarah knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Sarah stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear as the dead silence stretched on. Her breath was shallow, her pulse pounding in her ears. The echo of Emily's voice, faint and desperate, haunted her thoughts. It felt as if the room itself was closing in, pressing against her, suffocating her in its oppressive weight. "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head, trying to shake the fear that gripped her heart. "This isn't real." But the feeling wouldn't go away. The walls seemed to pulse with a low, unsettling hum, as though the house itself was alive, aware of her presence. The air was thick, heavy with an unseen pressure, as though the darkness was closing in, swallowing her whole. Her fingers trembled as she slowly set the phone down on the table. She couldn't bear to look at it any longer, but she knew it was just a matter of time before it would ring again. The thought of it made her stomach churn. Sarah took a step back, her gaze drifting to the hallway, where the shadows twisted and stretched, creating figures that seemed to move with the corners of her vision. Her heart raced, each beat echoing in her chest like a countdown to something terrible. She turned her back on the hallway and hurried toward the front door. She had to leave. She had to escape this nightmare before it consumed her too. But as she reached for the doorknob, she froze. The door wouldn't open. Sarah twisted the knob again, harder this time, but it didn't budge. Panic surged through her as she pulled on it with all her strength, but it was as if the door was sealed shut by some invisible force. "No, no, no, no!" Sarah cried, banging on the door with her fists, but the sound was muffled, lost in the thick silence of the house. There was no one there, no one to help her. She was alone, trapped. Her eyes darted around, desperately searching for any other escape. The windows were covered with thick curtains, their fabric heavy and suffocating. The air in the room was stale, cold, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A faint, flickering light coming from beneath the door of the basement. It was a soft, eerie glow casting long, twisting shadows across the floor. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she turned to face the door. She had never noticed it before. How could she have missed it? Without thinking, she moved toward it, drawn by the strange light, her feet moving against her will, as though the house itself was guiding her. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shock of fear through her fingertips. She hesitated for a moment, but the light seemed to beckon her, pulling her deeper into the house. She opened the door, and the light inside the basement flickered brighter, casting an unnatural glow that illuminated the stairs leading down into the darkness. "Emily?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She stepped forward, the chill of the air wrapping around her like a cold, suffocating blanket. As she descended the stairs, the light grew stronger, more intense. It seemed to pulse, alive, as if it were feeding on her fear. The walls of the basement were lined with old, dusty furniture, abandoned crates, and forgotten memories. But it was the center of the room that caught her attention. A mirror. It stood in the middle of the basement, tall and imposing, its surface reflecting the dim light in strange, twisted ways. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer to it, her breath fogging the glass with each shaky exhale. And then she saw it, her reflection. But it wasn't just her. There, standing behind her in the mirror, was Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty, staring directly at Sarah. But it wasn't just Emily. There were others, dozens of faces, each one twisted in a silent scream, their eyes pleading lost. "No!" Sarah screamed, stumbling back from the mirror, her heart racing in terror. "This isn't real. This isn't happening." But the faces in the mirror didn't fade. They stared at her, their expressions frozen in a never-ending, agonizing silence. "You're here, Sarah?" Emily's voice came again, but it was no longer a cry for help. It was a whisper, a promise. "You belong with us now." Sarah stumbled backward, her head spinning. Her vision blurred as the room seemed to tilt, the walls bending and twisting, the air thick with an unnatural energy. And then, everything went black. When Sarah opened her eyes again, she was lying on the floor of the basement, the cold stone beneath her pressing against her skin. Her body ached, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. She could hear the faint sound of a phone ringing in the distance. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No more." But the ringing didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was inside her head, echoing with the voices of the dead. "Answer it, Sarah." Emily's voice whispered from the darkness. "It's your turn now." And Sarah knew deep down that it would never stop. She would never escape. The house had claimed her, and now, like the others, she was trapped in the endless, agonizing cycle. As the phone continued to ring, Sarah's eyes slowly closed, her mind consumed by the cold darkness that surrounded her. And in the distance, she could hear the faint, eerie whispers of the others joining in, calling her name, urging her to answer. "Help me!" Emily's voice echoed one last time, and then the world faded into silence. Sarah's body trembled as she lay on the cold basement floor, the weight of her fear sinking deep into her bones. She could hear the phone ringing louder now, the sound filling every corner of the dark room. It was no longer just the call of a friend, but something more, something far older, far more dangerous. The house was alive. It had always been alive. It fed on the souls of those who dared to enter, trapping them in an endless loop of torment and despair. Sarah tried to move, but her limbs felt like they were made of stone. The faces in the mirror still haunted her, their eyes unblinking, their mouths frozen in silent screams. They had once been like her, alive, full of hope, but now they were nothing more than empty shells, echoes of their former selves. "Help me!" Emily's voice whispered again, this time from all directions. It was no longer a cry for help. It was a command. "Help me, Sarah. Join us." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the air around her grew colder, the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on her chest. She could feel the walls closing in, could hear the whispers of those who had come before her, their voices blending into a chorus of agony. She couldn't escape. The house wouldn't let her. She had entered, and now it owned her. Sarah finally managed to sit up, her head spinning, her vision blurred, and she swayed as she tried to focus on the phone that was still ringing, echoing through the basement like a death knell. "Pick it up, Sarah." Emily's voice was now joined by countless others, their words blending together into a low, hypnotic hum. "Pick it up. Answer it." The phone rang louder. Sarah's hand hovered over it, her fingers trembling. She didn't want to answer. She couldn't. But the voices, so close now, so real, demanded it. With a shaking breath, Sarah picked up the phone. "Hello," she whispered, her voice shaking. There was a long pause, followed by a soft, familiar voice, one she had never expected to hear again. "Sarah," Emily's voice whispered, but it was not the voice of her friend. It was cold, unfeeling. "I'm here, just like I promised." And then, all at once, the darkness consumed her. The whispers grew louder, the faces from the mirror swirling around her like a storm. She could feel their icy hands on her skin, pulling her deeper into the shadows. The phone went silent, but Sarah could still hear Emily's voice in her mind. "You'll never leave now." And as the basement swallowed her whole, the house claimed another soul. Sarah couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened as she felt the cold hands of those trapped in the house, those who had come before her, wrap around her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. The phone had fallen from her grasp, but the echo of Emily's voice still rang in her ears. The whispers were all around her now, relentless and suffocating, a chorus of voices that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her body felt like it was being swallowed whole by the darkness that surrounded her. The house wasn't just a house, it was a prison, a living thing, and it had been feeding on souls for years, trapping them in its endless cycle of torment. "Emily," Sarah gasped, her mind spinning as the faces in the mirrors around her blurred together, the expressions frozen in eternal agony. "What is this place?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but she could feel the presence of Emily, of all those who had been consumed by the house, closing in around her. Emily's voice, once so full of life, now sounded cold and hollow. "It's too late, Sarah. It always has been." Sarah tried to stand, tried to escape the overwhelming presence that gripped her. But it was no use. Her body wouldn't obey. The house had already claimed her. "You belong to us now," the voices whispered in unison, 1,000 voices merging into one. "We all belong to the house." The floor beneath Sarah seemed to tremble as the walls shifted and creaked, the house shifting like a living thing. The mirrors, once dull and lifeless, now began to distort. Faces twisted in agony stared back at her, their eyes pleading for escape, but their mouths could never speak. The ringing phone had stopped. The silence was deafening now. Sarah's vision darkened, the edges of her sight blurring, as though she were being pulled into the very walls. The house, with its hunger, had taken hold of her. There was no escaping it. She could feel her essence, her very soul, being siphoned away, lost to the darkness that consumed everything it touched. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The basement was silent. Sarah was gone. Outside, the world continued on, oblivious to the horrors hidden within that house. But deep in the heart of it, the house waited, patient and eternal, for the next soul to stumble across its threshold. And the cycle would begin again. Let's start with the next story. When Emily first moved into the new house, she didn't expect it to be much different from the others. It was a 2-story home, nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. Her parents had been excited about it, especially her mom, who had spent months packing up their old life in the city. Emily wasn't so sure. She didn't mind the change, but she wasn't ready to leave behind everything she knew. Her bedroom was at the back of the house, with a window that looked out over the yard. The room was larger than the one she had before, with old wooden floors and a faint smell of dust. A large closet filled most of one wall, and across from the bed was an old desk, hidden beneath a thick layer of cobwebs. It was clear that the room hadn't been used in years. The first night was hard for Emily. The house was unfamiliar, the shadows in the corners strange, and the silence suffocating. The walls seemed to creak at odd times, and she swore she heard something moving in the attic. But that first night, she didn't think much of it. She had been through changes before. Moving from one place to another wasn't new to her. It was just the adjustment period. But when she woke up the next morning, something caught her eye. On the desk, buried beneath the dust and old papers, was a small, leather-bound book. It was a diary, its edges frayed and worn with age. Curious, Emily picked it up and brushed the dust off its cover. It was thick, its pages yellowed and fragile, but still intact. She flipped it open. The first page was filled with neat handwriting. The words were simple, but the feeling they carried was strange. It was almost as if the person writing the diary had been speaking directly to her. Today is the day we move. The house smells like fresh paint, but there's something else here too. A feeling, like something is watching us. Emily shivered. She had barely thought about the house like that before. It was just a house, nothing more, nothing less. But the words on the page felt different. Something about them made her skin prickle with unease. She skimmed through more of the diary, feeling a strange pull and need to know more. As she turned each page, the entries grew more detailed. The author described their life, their routines, their thoughts. Everything was written down with such precision, as if they had been watching from the shadows, seeing every move. Emily couldn't help but be intrigued. She felt like an intruder as she read the diary, like she was uncovering something that wasn't meant to be found. The house feels colder today. I swear I hear footsteps in the hall, but when I check, no one is there. I think the house is trying to tell me something. Emily paused at those words. It felt like she had read them before. A chill ran down her spine. She couldn't explain why, but the diary felt familiar. As if she were reading about her own life, her own thoughts. She closed the book for a moment, her heart racing in her chest. Maybe it was just the strange atmosphere of the house making her overthink things. Maybe it was just her imagination. But when she opened the diary again, something caught her eye. The last entry, written in a hurried, frantic scrawl, was different from the others. The words were jagged, almost incoherent. It's coming. I can feel it. There's something in the dark, something watching me. I can't escape it. I can't run. Tomorrow it will take me. Emily stared at the page, her hand trembling as she reached for the diary. The words seemed to blur, the ink smudging beneath her fingers. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around the room, as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the emptiness of the old room. Her mind raced. Who had written this diary? And why did it feel like the person had been talking about her? Was it some kind of coincidence, or was something more sinister at play? Emily sat there for a long moment, frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The quiet of the room pressed in on her, making everything feel too still. She closed the diary and shoved it under her pillow, determined not to think about it. But as she lay in bed that night, the words echoed in her mind. Tomorrow it will take me. She didn't know what that meant, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was happening that she couldn't explain. The next morning, Emily woke up to the usual sounds of the house. The creaking of the floorboards, the wind rustling through the trees outside. But something felt different. The air felt heavier, as if the house itself were holding its breath. She tried to push the feeling away, but it lingered. She thought about the diary again. The words seemed to haunt her. the way they had described things she hadn't even told anyone. She hadn't said anything to her parents about the strange feelings she'd had in the house or the noises she'd heard. And yet, the diary had mentioned those same things, word for word. It's coming. Emily couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to find out who had written this diary and what had happened to them. The need to know consumed her, and she began searching through the house. She looked in every corner, every crevice, hoping for a clue. Then, as she was rifling through the attic, she found something. It was an old photograph, yellowed with age, stuck in a dusty frame. The image was of a girl who looked strikingly similar to Emily. Same eyes, same dark hair. The girl was smiling, her face bright with life. But something about the photo felt wrong. The air around it felt cold, almost suffocating. It was as though the girl in the photograph had been caught in the middle of a memory, frozen in time. "I can't escape it," Emily whispered to herself, her voice shaking as she stared at the picture. The words of the diary echoed in her mind, the same words that had been written there, in the pages she had just read. Something was watching her. Emily's heart raced as she stood frozen in the attic, the old photograph gripped tightly in her hands. The feeling of dread crept up her spine like a cold hand. She could hear the faint rustling of the wind outside, but in the attic, it felt like there was something more, something alive, something that had been waiting. Her eyes kept flicking back to the photo, unable to tear herself away. The girl's smile was so familiar, but her eyes were full of something dark, something hollow. Emily couldn't understand why, but she felt like she knew her. The more she stared, the more unsettling the photograph became, like it was staring back at her. She backed away slowly, unsure of what to do. It felt as if the air itself were thickening, pressing in around her. Her breath came faster, and she suddenly wanted to escape the attic, to leave that feeling behind. But as she turned to head for the stairs, something caught her eye. On the far wall of the attic, a door. It was small, almost hidden behind a stack of old boxes. Emily had never noticed it before. She walked over to it cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The door creaked open with a loud groan, revealing a small, dimly lit space beyond. Inside, it was cold. The walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, and the floorboards groaned under her feet. But it was the shelves that caught her attention. They were lined with old books, notebooks, and more diaries, just like the one she had found in her room. Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. This was no coincidence. She began sifting through the books, pulling one from the shelf. It was a diary, its leather cover cracked and worn, its pages yellow with age. She opened it, and immediately her breath caught. The handwriting was the same. It was the same neat, precise script she had seen in the first diary, the one that had described her life so perfectly. The first entry was dated decades ago. "The house feels alive. It watches me when I sleep, whispers to me in the dark. I can't escape it. I don't think anyone can." Emily felt a shiver crawl down her spine as she continued reading. Each entry was more disturbing than the last. The author described their isolation in the house, the strange feelings they experienced, and the growing sense that something was wrong. The entries mirrored the ones from the diary she had found in her room. Everything from the cold spots to the unsettling noises to the growing sense of dread. It was all there, word for word. "The house is trying to take me. I can feel it closing in. I hear it in the walls. It watches me through the cracks. I don't know how much longer I can keep writing, but I must warn someone. The last person who lived here never made it out. I won't be the last." Emily's mind raced. She had to know more. She flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling as she moved to the final entry. The handwriting was now messy, hurried, almost frantic. "It's getting closer. I can feel its breath on my neck. It's here. It's coming. I won't survive this. No one ever does. The diary will be found, and someone will read it, just like I did. But it won't matter, because once you've read it, you're already too late. Emily froze. The last sentence, the final words that had been scrawled with panic. Too late. Her chest tightened, and her throat went dry. She quickly slammed the diary shut, her heart pounding in her ears. She couldn't breathe. The silence in the attic was deafening. It felt like the walls were closing in around her, like the house itself was alive and watching. She felt the same weight she had felt in her room, the same pressure, the same sense of impending doom. She had to get out. With the diary clutched tightly in her hands, Emily rushed out of the attic, nearly tripping over the old floorboards as she descended the stairs. She needed to talk to someone, to her parents, to anyone. She needed to know what was happening, what the house wanted. But when she reached the bottom of the stairs, the air in the house felt wrong. The quiet was oppressive, heavier than before. The lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows across the walls. Emily's breath quickened as she turned to look around, her eyes scanning every corner of the house. And then she heard it, a faint whisper, like the soft rustle of paper in the wind. She turned sharply, expecting to see someone standing behind her. But there was no one. The whisper came again, clearer this time, and it sounded like her own name. Emily. Her pulse quickened as she backed away, her eyes darting across the room. The whispering continued, growing louder, more urgent. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, though no one was there. Emily's heart raced as she clutched the diary tighter, her knuckles turning white. Emily. It was coming from the other side of the house. She didn't want to go toward it. She didn't want to know who or what was calling her name. But she had to. The house, it was pulling her in. She stepped cautiously toward the sound, the floor creaking beneath her feet. The closer she got, the more intense the whispering became. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, calling to her. And then she reached the door. It was the door to the basement. The handle was cold beneath her fingers as she slowly turned it. She couldn't explain why, but she knew she had to go down there. It was like the house was guiding her, urging her to open the door and step inside. With a deep breath, she pulled it open. The darkness in the basement was thick and suffocating, the air heavy with dust. She hesitated for a moment before stepping down into the gloom. The whispering grew louder, but it wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a voice that was familiar, so familiar that Emily could barely breathe. Emily, come closer. The voice beckoned her forward, deeper into the darkness. She had to fight the overwhelming urge to run, to escape. But she knew she couldn't. She had to find the source of the voice. She had to know what was happening. And so, with the diary pressed tightly to her chest, she descended into the basement. The basement was colder than the rest of the house. The air felt damp, almost suffocating. Emily's footsteps echoed as she walked down the narrow stairs, each creak of the wooden steps causing her heart to race. The voice was still there, calling her name softly, coaxing her forward like a siren's song. It felt like she was being pulled deeper into the very core of the house. She reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself standing in front of a small, dimly lit room. The whispering had stopped, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her inside. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She could feel her pulse pounding in her neck, the fear creeping in, but something inside her urged her to open the door. With a sharp breath, she twisted the knob. The room was small, almost claustrophobic. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old jars and strange objects she couldn't recognize. But what caught her attention immediately was the small, wooden desk at the far corner of the room. On it lay a single object, a tarnished silver key. The key glowed faintly in the dim light, its surface covered in intricate carvings. Emily felt an overwhelming compulsion to pick it up, to hold it in her hand. Her fingers brushed against it, and a cold shiver ran up her spine. She could almost hear the faintest whisper in her ear, as if the key were calling to her, too. "You found it!" Emily's breath caught in her throat. The voice wasn't coming from the room. It was inside her head. The words felt wrong, as if they weren't meant for her at all. But the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. The key will unlock what you need. She couldn't understand what it meant. What could the key unlock? She didn't know, but she knew she had to take it. She had no choice. As her fingers wrapped around the cold metal, a flood of memories hit her all at once, memories that weren't hers. She saw a young woman standing in front of the very door she had just opened, holding a key like the one in her hand. The woman was smiling, but there was a sadness in her eyes. Then the vision shifted. The woman was inside the room, standing before the shelves, trembling as she stared at something on one of the shelves. Emily felt the woman's fear, her terror, as she reached for a small black book. The pages of the book were filled with strange symbols and incomprehensible words. As the woman flipped through the pages, Emily felt the weight of an ancient curse closing in around her. It's too late to stop it. The vision blurred, and Emily was back in the basement, holding the key tightly in her hand. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her legs felt weak. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow connected to that woman, that her fate was intertwined with hers. Emily stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The key felt heavier now, like it had a purpose, a destination she didn't understand. The basement felt colder, darker, as if the walls were closing in on her. But there was a strange pull, a magnetic force guiding her toward the far corner of the room. It was then that she noticed the small door hidden beneath a pile of old crates. It was barely visible, but it was there. The same markings as the key were etched into the wood of the door, the same carvings that decorated the key. Emily's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was what she had been led to. She walked toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The coldness of the metal seemed to seep into her skin as she turned it. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed to reverberate throughout the entire house. Beyond the door was a narrow, winding staircase leading down into an even darker pit. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Emily's instincts screamed at her to turn back, to escape while she still could, but she couldn't. The pull was too strong. She had to know what lay at the bottom of those stairs. With one last glance over her shoulder, Emily stepped forward. The staircase seemed endless, winding down into the abyss. Each step was more treacherous than the last, and the darkness seemed to grow thicker the further she went. The air was suffocating down here, and Emily could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on her. It was like the house itself was alive, breathing, watching her as she descended deeper. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emily reached the bottom. The air down here was thick with dust, and the walls seemed to close in around her. But there, in the center of the room, was an altar. It was covered in strange symbols, just like the ones in the diary. And on top of the altar lay a small, leather-bound book. Emily stepped forward, her heart pounding as she reached for it. The moment her fingers brushed against the cover, the room seemed to tremble. The air grew colder, and a low, rumbling sound echoed from somewhere deep within the house. Emily's eyes widened in terror as she realized what she had just done. She had unlocked something that should have stayed buried. You shouldn't have come. The voice echoed in her mind, but it wasn't just in her head anymore. The words seemed to come from every direction, as if the house itself were speaking to her. She turned, and in the corner of the room she saw it. A figure, a dark, twisted shape standing in the shadows. Its eyes glowed a sickly green, and its skin was stretched tight over its bones. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it moved toward her with an unnatural speed. Emily froze, her body paralyzed with fear. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. The figure reached out with long, gnarled fingers, its touch cold and suffocating. And then in that moment, Emily understood. The house wasn't just alive. It was feeding on her, feeding on everyone who had come before her. The diary, the key, the book, everything had been a part of the curse. And now it was her turn. The figure stepped closer, its smile twisted and cruel. And as it reached out to claim her, Emily realized that she would never leave this place. She had unlocked the door, but it had unlocked something far worse in return. The last thing she heard was a whisper, the same whisper that had followed her from the moment she first read the diary. Too late, and then there was nothing. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.